Hi, Ree, Kendra, Kyla, Kelsey, and everybody else. I hope you're having a good time at Elwood City. I've been pretty busy. I've been working on my sermon and working on my camp lessons for the next 2 weeks. I got a haircut today. Nice and short, just like we like it, huh? Well, anyway, I was thinking over the last couple of days, realizing that it was going to be 2 or 2.5 weeks maybe before we get to see each other again. I hope we get to talk on the phone several times, but I'm sure it'll be a while before we get to see each other. So I thought maybe I would try this method of keeping in touch and hope that it works at least as good as it can. It's not like being there, but maybe it's something close to that anyway. What I had in mind was that I'd like to read you guys some stories on tape, and maybe Mom or someone could plug that in at night before you go to bed, and that would give you a chance to at least hear me read some stories to you. Now, I don't think I'll be able to have enough stories for every night, but I'll try to do several. I went to the library today. I looked here first, Kendra and Kyla, for you specifically, for our Chronicles of Narnia series, and I couldn't find them. So I went to the library, and I got the third book, since we'd read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and most of Prince Caspian. I thought we could just kind of start with a whole new book. So I have the third book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and I'll try in some of the different segments to read you guys a chapter out of that. And then Kelsey, for you especially, I got some books that I thought you might really like. So what I'll try to do in each segment is read one of the books that I think Kelsey might really like, and read a chapter out of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader for you, Kendra, and Kyla. So I hope it works well, and I hope you guys enjoy it. We'll see what happens. Kelsey, this is one of the books I picked out for you. It's called How to Scare a Lion. Now, I would show you the pictures, but I already tried to do this once, and when I ran it back, you couldn't see the pictures very well at all, okay? So I'll just be reading the stories. How to Scare a Lion. In all the world, Leonard was the fiercest of all lions, and fearless Frederick was the bravest of all lion tamers. They were the greatest act and the greatest show on earth. Wherever the circus traveled, people came from miles around to see Frederick and Leonard perform in the center ring. They came to see Leonard balance on a barrel, dance to a waltz, and jump through a flaming hoop. But most of all, they came to see Frederick put his head into Leonard's mouth. No wonder they called him Frederick Fearless. After this trick, Leonard would roar his loudest, Frederick would bow his lowest, and the people would shout, "Hurrah, hurrah!" Leonard and Frederick loved working in the circus. They loved the crowds and the children and the cheers. Leonard especially loved cotton candy. Eating cotton candy always gave Leonard a pink mustache, and one day it gave him something else too. It gave him hiccups. Now, fearless Frederick was not afraid of lions or tigers or leopards, but he was afraid of Leonard's hiccups. Whenever a hiccup came along, Leonard's jaws closed with a loud bang. Frederick was afraid that one of Leonard's hiccups might chop off his head. Something had to be done. Frederick frowned and said sternly, "Don't just hiccup, Leonard. Do something." So Leonard did. He held his breath until he was blue. He drank water until he was filled to the very brim. And he stood on his head until he was dizzy. But Leonard's hiccups kept coming. Blue hiccups, wet hiccups, even upside down hiccups. Then Leonard blew up balloons until he was out of breath. The balloons with Leonard's hiccups inside them bounced around like Mexican jumping beans. Leonard was hiccuping better than ever. Frederick knew that a really good scare was a sure cure for hiccups. But, thought Frederick, how do you scare a lion? He decided to ask his friend Calvin, the human cannonball. Calvin said, perhaps being shot out of a cannon will scare a lion. So Frederick and Leonard climbed into Calvin's big cannon. As they climbed farther and farther and farther inside, it got darker and darker and darker. Leonard said, "Frederick, I don't think I like this way of scaring you." They could hear Calvin counting. 3, 2, 1, 0, fire! The cannon exploded with a booming bang. Frederick and Leonard shot through the air faster and faster and faster until they bounced into a big net. When they stopped bouncing, Frederick asked, "Wasn't that scary, Leonard?" Leonard answered loudly, "Hick." "Oh, Leonard," said Frederick, "if being shot out of a cannon won't scare a lion, what will?" Frederick decided to ask his friend Walter the wire walker. Walter said perhaps a walk across the high wire will scare a lion. So Frederick took Leonard up the tall ladder leading to the high wire that stretched across the top of the tent. They climbed higher and higher and higher. Frederick looked down. The ring was far below. Frederick felt dizzy. Leonard said, "Frederick, I don't think I like this way of scaring you either." When they reached the top of the ladder, Frederick climbed onto Leonard's back. He held on tight to Leonard's mane. Leonard started out across the wire, first one paw and then the other. Each time Leonard hiccuped, he bounced up and down on the wire, up and down, so that half the time they weren't on the wire at all. When they reached the ladder on the other side, Frederick asked, "Wasn't that scary, Leonard?" Leonard started to answer, but at that very moment a hiccup came along that was so big it made the ladder shake, and it made Frederick shake too. Frederick was glad to get down on the ground again. He said, "That was a very big hiccup, Leonard. You're going to need a very big scare." So Frederick and Leonard went to see Eloise, the biggest elephant in the circus. Eloise did a very special trick with Mr. Elmer, her trainer. First, Mr. Elmer would lie down on the ground. Then Eloise would lower her foot until it was so close to Mr. Elmer that she seemed to be standing on him. Eloise had to be very careful not to come too close, just close enough to give everyone a big scare. Frederick asked Eloise to scare Leonard. Eloise liked to scare people, and she thought she would like to scare a lion too. Frederick was worried. Eloise looked even bigger from underneath. Suppose she forgot to be careful. Leonard said, "Frederick, I don't think I like this way of scaring you at all." Frederick and Leonard lay down on the ground. Eloise lowered her foot closer and closer and closer. Frederick closed his eyes. He didn't want to look, but Leonard kept his eyes open. He had never seen the bottom of an elephant's foot before. It was big and round, and Eloise's foot was so close it tickled Leonard's whiskers. Suddenly, Leonard hiccuped the loudest hiccup ever. It was so loud that Eloise forgot all about scaring Leonard. She trumpeted loudly and ran for her life. "Come back, Eloise, come back," shouted Frederick. But Eloise kept running further and further and further away from Leonard and his giant hiccups. "Leonard," said Frederick, "I'm afraid that was a good way to scare an elephant, but a bad way to scare a lion." Frederick was really getting worried. Oh, what could possibly scare a lion? Frederick thought and thought, but he couldn't think of anything scary enough. Then Frederick decided to ask all his friends to help him think. He asked all the circus performers to come to a big meeting in the big tent. When everyone was there, Frederick asked them, "What is the scariest thing in the whole world? What is scary enough to scare Leonard?" Everyone started thinking. For a long time, everyone was silent. Everyone but Leonard, anyway. He kept saying, "Hick." At last, Cookie the Clown said, "I'm sorry, Frederick, but I can't think of anything that scary." The other performers shook their heads sadly. There was no use of thinking anymore. There was just nothing in the whole world scary enough to scare Leonard. It was almost showtime. A great crowd had gathered in the big tent. They had come to see the greatest show on earth, especially fearless Frederick, the bravest of all lion tamers. But Frederick wasn't fearless anymore. He was afraid of losing his head, and all on account of a hiccup. Frederick and Leonard walked slowly toward the big tent. Every 3 steps they stopped for Leonard to go hick, and for Frederick to sigh and shake his head sadly. All the circus performers were busy getting ready for the show. Frederick and Leonard stopped to watch Cookie put on his clown clothes. Cookie put on his funny long shoes and his funny long tie. Then he looked in his big mirror and put on his funny long nose. Now he was ready for the show. Cookie made a few funny faces to try to cheer up Frederick, but it was no use. Frederick was too sad to be cheery. Suddenly there was a loud roar from Leonard. Leonard shouted, "Frederick, what's wrong?" Poor Leonard, he was shivering, he was shuddering, he was shaking. Then Frederick saw what Leonard saw. Leonard was looking at himself in Cookie's big mirror. "Hurrah!" shouted Frederick, "hurrah!" Leonard had the shivers and the shudders and the shakes, but he didn't have the hiccups. Not anymore. Leonard had found out for himself how to scare a lion. Okay, Kendra, Kyla, and whoever else might be listening in. C.S. Lewis, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Chapter 1, The Picture in the Bedroom. There was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. His parents called him Eustace Clarence, and his masters called him Scrubb. I can't tell you how his friends spoke to him, for he had none. He didn't call his father and mother, but Harold and Alberta. They were very up-to-date and advanced people. They were vegetarians, non-smokers, and teetotalers, and wore a special kind of underclothes. In their house there was very little furniture and very few clothes on the beds, and the windows were always open. Eustace Clarence liked animals, especially beetles, if they were dead and pinned on a card. He liked books if they were books of information and had pictures of grain elevators or fat foreign children doing exercises in model schools. Eustace Clarence disliked his cousins, the four Pevensies, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. But he was quite glad when he heard that Edmund and Lucy were coming to stay. For deep down inside him, he liked bossing and bullying, and though he was a puny little person who couldn't have stood up even to Lucy, let alone Edmund, in a fight, he knew that there are dozens of ways to give people a bad time if you are in your own home and they are only visitors. Edmund and Lucy did not at all want to come and stay with Uncle Harold and Aunt Alberta, but it really couldn't be helped. Father had got a job lecturing in America for 16 weeks that summer, and Mother was to go with him because she hadn't had a real holiday for 10 years. Peter was working very hard for an exam, and he was to spend the holidays being coached by old Professor Kirk, in whose house these four children had had wonderful adventures long ago in the war years. If he had still been in that house, he would have had them all to stay. But he had somehow become poor since the old days and was living in a small cottage with only one bedroom to spare. It would have cost too much money to take the other three all to America, and Susan had gone. Grown-ups thought her the pretty one of the family, and she was no good at schoolwork, though otherwise very old for her age. And Mother said she would get far more out of a trip to America than the youngsters. Edmund and Lucy tried not to grudge Susan her luck, but it was dreadful having to spend the summer holidays at their aunt's. "But it's far worse for me," said Edmund, "because you'll at least have a room of your own, and I shall have to share a bedroom with that record stinker Eustace." The story begins on an afternoon when Edmund and Lucy were stealing a few precious minutes alone together. And of course they were talking about Narnia, which was the name of their own private and secret country. Most of us, I suppose, have a secret country, but for most of it, it is only an imaginary country. Edmund and Lucy were luckier than other people in that respect. Their secret country was real. They had already visited it twice, not in a game or a dream, but in reality. They had got there, of course, by magic, which is the only way of getting to Narnia, and a promise, or very nearly a promise, had been made them in Narnia itself, that they would someday get back. You may imagine that they talked about it a good deal when they got the chance. They were in Lucy's room, sitting on the edge of her bed and looking at a picture on the opposite wall. It was the only picture in the house that they liked. Aunt Alberta didn't like it at all. That was why it was put away in a little back room upstairs. But she couldn't get rid of it because it had been a wedding present from someone she did not want to offend. It was a picture of a ship sailing nearly straight towards you. Her prow was gilded and shaped like the head of a dragon with wide open mouth. She had only one mast and one large square sail, which was a rich purple. The sides of the ships, what you could see of them, where the gilded wings of the dragon ended, were green. She had just run up to the top of one glorious blue wave, and the nearer slope of that wave came down towards you with streaks and bubbles on it. She was obviously running fast before a gay wind, listening over a little on her port side. By the way, if you're going to read this story at all, and if you don't know already, you had better get it into your head that the left of a ship, when you are looking ahead, is port, and the right is starboard. All the sunlight fell on her from that side, and the water on that side was full of greens and purples. On the other, it was darker blue from the shadow of the ship. "The question is," said Edmund, "whether it doesn't make things worse looking at a Narnian ship when you can't get there." "Even looking is better than nothing," said Lucy. "And she is such a very Narnian ship." "Still playing your old game?" said Eustace Clarence, who had been listening outside the door and now came grinning into the room. Last year, when he had been staying with the Pevensies, he had managed to hear them all talking of Narnia, and he loved teasing them about it. He thought, of course, that they were making it all up, and as he was far too stupid to make anything up himself, he did not approve of that. "You're not wanted here," said Edmund curtly. "I'm trying to think of a limerick," said Eustace, "something like this. Some kids who played games about Narnia got gradually balmier and balmier." "Well, Narnia and balmier don't rhyme to begin with," said Lucy. "It's an assonance," said Eustace. "Don't ask him what a assy thingamagummy is," said Edmund. "He's only going to be asked." or he's longing to be asked. Say nothing and perhaps he'll go away. Most boys, on meeting a reception like this, would either have cleared out or flared up. Eustace did neither. He just hung about grinning and presently began talking again. Do you like that picture? He asked. For heaven's sake, don't let them get started about art and all that, said Edmund hurriedly. But Lucy, who was very truthful, had already said, yes, I do. I like it very much. It's a rotten picture, said Eustace. You won't see it if you step outside, said Edmund. Why do you like it? Said Eustace to Lucy. Well, for one thing, said Lucy, I like it because the ship looks as if it was really moving. And the water looks as if it was really wet. And the waves look as if they were really going up and down. Of course, Eustace knew lots of answers to this, but he didn't say anything. The reason was that at that very moment he looked at the waves and saw that they did look very much indeed as if they were going up and down. He had only once been in a ship, and then only as far as the Isle of Wight, and had been horribly seasick. The look of the waves in the picture made him feel sick again. He turned rather green and tried another look, and then all three children were staring with open mouths. What they were seeing may be hard to believe when you read it in print, but it was almost as hard to believe when you saw it happening. The things in the picture were moving. It didn't look at all like a cinema either. The colors were too real and clean and out of door for that. Down went the prow of the ship into the wave, and up went a great shock of spray. And then up went the wave behind her, and her stern and her deck became visible for the first time, and then disappeared as the next wave came to meet her, and her bows went up again. At the same moment, an exercise book, which had been lying beside Edmund on the bed, flapped, rose, and sailed through the air to the wall behind him. And Lucy felt all her hair whipping round her face as it does on a windy day. And this was a windy day, but the wind was blowing out of the picture towards them. And suddenly, with the wind came the noises, the swishing of waves and the slap of water against the ship's side and the creaking and the overall high, steady roar of air and water. But it was the smell, the wild, briny smell, which really convinced Lucy that she was not dreaming. Stop it, came Eustace's voice, squeaky with fright and bad temper. It's some silly trick you two are playing. Stop it, I'll tell Alberta, Al. The other two were much more accustomed to adventures, but just exactly as Eustace Clarence said Al, they both said Al too. The reason was that a great cold salt splash had broken right out of the frame, and they were breathless from the smack of it, besides being wet through. I'll smash the rotten thing, cried Eustace. And then several things happened at the same time. Eustace rushed toward the picture. Edmund, who knew something about magic, sprang after him, warning him to look out and not to be a fool. Lucy grabbed at him from the other side and was dragged forward, and by this time either they had grown much smaller or the picture had grown bigger. Eustace jumped to try to pull it off the wall and found himself standing on the frame. In front of him was not glass, but real sea, and wind and waves rushing up to the frame as they might to a rock. He lost his head and clutched at the other two who had jumped up beside him. There was a second of struggling and shouting, and just as they thought they had got their balance, a great blue roller surged up round them, swept them off their feet, and drew them down into the sea. Eustace's despairing cry suddenly ended as the water got into his mouth. Lucy thanked her stars that she had worked hard at her swimming last summer term. It is true that she would have got on much better if she had used a slower stroke, and also that the water felt a great deal colder than it had looked while it was only a picture. Still, she kept her head and kicked her shoes off as everyone ought to do who falls into deep water in their clothes. She even kept her mouth shut and her eyes open. They were still quite near the ship. She saw its green side towering high above them, and people looking at her from the deck. Then, as one might have expected, Eustace clutched at her in a panic, and down they both went. When they came up again, she saw a white figure diving off the ship's side. Edmund was close beside her now, treading water, and had caught the arms of the howling Eustace. Then someone else, whose face was vaguely familiar, slipped an arm under her from the other side. There was a lot of shouting going on from the ship, heads crowding together above the bulwarks, ropes being thrown. Edmund and the stranger were fastening ropes about her. After that followed what seemed a very long delay, during which her face got blue and her teeth began chattering. In reality, the delay was not very long. They were waiting till the moment when she could be got on board the ship without being dashed against its side. Even with all their best endeavors, she had a bruised knee when she finally stood, dripping and shivering on the deck. After her, Edmund was heaved up, and then the miserable Eustace. Last of all came the stranger, a golden-headed boy some years older than herself. Caspian, gasped Lucy as soon as she had breath enough. For Caspian it was. Caspian, the boy king of Narnia, whom they had helped to set on the throne during their last visit. Immediately, Edmund recognized him too. All three shook hands and clapped one another on the back with great delight. "But who is your friend?" said Caspian, almost at once, turning to Eustace with his cheerful smile. But Eustace was crying much harder than any boy of his age has a right to cry when nothing worse than a wetting has happened to him, and would only yell, let me go back, I don't like it." "Let you go," said Caspian. "But where?" Eustace rushed to the ship's side as if he expected to see the picture frame hanging above the sea. and perhaps a glimpse of Lucy's bedroom. What he saw was blue waves flecked with foam and paler blue sky, both spreading without a break to the horizon. Perhaps we can hardly blame him if his heart sank. He was promptly sick. "Hey, Rhinell," said Caspian to one of the sailors, "bring spiced wine for their majesties. You'll need something to warm you up after that dip." He called Edmund and Lucy their majesties because they and Peter and Susan had all been kings and queens of Narnia long before his time. Narnian time flows differently from ours. If you spent 100 years in Narnia, you would still come back to our world at the very same hour of the very same day on which you left. And then if you went back to Narnia after spending a week here, you might find that 1,000 Narnian years had passed, or only a day, or no time at all. You never know till you get there. Consequently, when the children had returned to Narnia last time for their second visit, it was for the Narnians as if King Arthur came back to Britain, as some people say he will. And I say the sooner the better. Rhinelf returned with the spiced wine steaming in a flagon in 4 silver cups. It was just what one wanted, and as Lucy and Edmund sipped it, they could feel the warmth going right down to their toes. But Eustace made faces and spluttered and spat it out and was sick again and began to cry again and asked if they hadn't any Plumptree's vitaminized nerve food and could it be made with distilled water, and anyway he insisted on being put ashore at the next station. "This is a merry shipmate you've brought us, brother," whispered Caspian to Edmund with a chuckle. But before he could say anything more, Eustace burst out again. "Oh, ugh, what on earth is that? Take it away, the horrid thing." He really had some excuse this time for feeling a little surprised. Something very curious indeed had come out of the cabin in the poop and was slowly approaching him. You might call it, and indeed it was, a mouse. But then it was a mouse on its hind legs and stood about 2 feet high. A thin band of gold passed around its head under one ear and over the other, and in this was stuck a long crimson feather. As the mouse's fur was very dark, almost black, the effect was bold and striking. Its left paw rested on the hilt of a sword very nearly as long as its tail. Its balance, as it paced gravely along the swaying deck, was perfect, and its manners courtly. Lucy and Edmund recognized it at once. Reepicheep, the most valiant of all the talking beasts of Narnia, and the chief mouse. It had won undying glory in the second battle of Varuna. Lucy longed, as she had always done, to take Reepicheep up in her arms and cuddle him. But this, as she well knew, was a pleasure she could never have. It would have offended him deeply. Instead, she went down on one knee to talk to him. Reepicheep put forward his left leg, drew back his right, bowed, kissed her hand, straightened himself, twirled his whiskers, and said in his shrill, piping voice, "My humble duty to your majesty, and to King Edmund, too." Here he bowed again. "Nothing except your majesty's presence was lacking to this glorious venture." "Ugh, take it away," wailed Euston. "I hate mice, and I never could bear performing animals. They're silly and vulgar and sentimental." "Am I to understand," said Reepicheep to Lucy after a long stare at Eustace, "that this singularly discourteous person is under your majesty's protection? Because if not—" At this moment Lucy and Edmund both sneezed. "What a fool I am to keep you all standing here in your wet things," said Caspian. "Come on below and get changed. I'll give you my cabin, of course, Lucy, but I'm afraid we have no women's clothes on board. You'll have to make do with some of mine. Lead the way, Reepicheep, like a good fellow." "To the convenience of a lady," said Reepicheep. "Even a question of honor must give way, at least for the moment." And here he looked very hard at Eustace. But Caspian hustled them on, and in a few minutes Lucy found herself passing through the door into the stern cabin. She fell in love with it at once. The 3 square windows that looked out on the blue swirling water astern, the low cushioned benches around 3 sides of the table, the swinging silver lamp overhead, dwarf's work, she knew at once by its exquisite delicacy, and the flat gold image of Aslan the lion on the forward wall above the door. All this she took in a flash, for Caspian immediately opened a door on the starboard side and said, "This'll be your room, Lucy. I'll just get some dry things for myself." He was rummaging in one of the lockers while he spoke. "And then leave you to change. If you'll fling your wet things outside the door, I'll get them taken to the galley to be dried." Lucy found herself as much at home as if she had been in Caspian's cabin for weeks. And the motion of the ship did not worry her, for in the old days when she had been a queen in Narnia, she had done a good deal of voyaging. The cabin was very tiny but bright with painted panels, all birds and beasts and crimson dragons and vines, and spotlessly clean. Caspian's clothes were too big for her, but she could manage. His shoes, sandals, and sea boots were hopelessly big, but she did not mind going barefoot on board ship. When she had finished dressing, she looked out of her window at the water rushing past and took a long, deep breath. She felt quite sure they were in for a lovely time. That's the end of chapter 1. Kelsey, this book is titled Little Toad to the Rescue. My boy will have to face it. Our little world is drying up, Old Toad told Little Toad. They sat in the dusty vegetable garden watching the cabbage leaves curl. It really was a very serious situation, for toads cannot live unless their skin is moist. Little Toad could feel himself beginning to dry out. He went to the shower and pulled the string. No water. It hadn't rained since the Tuesday before last, and the barrel was empty. Little Toad hurried back to Old Toad. Old Toad looked hot and unhappy. He croaked, "Emergency measures are called for. Today my knee pains me so much I can't travel, but you, Little Toad, must go to Green Pond for water." Little Toad was excited. He had never been to Green Pond, which was far, far away. Grandfather showed him on the map the best way to go. All the way through the garden and past the pine trees, across the wide road, over the long grassy field, and at last down the steep hill to the pond. "It's a long trip, my boy, but I know you can do it," said Old Toad urgently. "Just keep away from the wicked crow who has an appetite for toads. If you see him, run for cover as fast as you can. Now off with you, hop to it." Little Toad felt very important. Grabbing the emergency buckets, he left at once. As Little Toad went past the tomato plants, he looked up and saw a fat tomato worm eating fresh green tomatoes. "Hello, tomato worm, I'm going to get some water at Green Pond," he called. "Hello, Little Toad," Tomato Worm answered. He talked with his mouth full, spraying out chunks with every word. Little Toad wiped pieces of tomato out of his eye. "I see you're eating. Don't let me disturb you. I'm in a hurry anyway," he said, heading toward the string bean patch. Green Spider was spinning a new web between two bean poles. "Hello, Miss Spider," called Little Toad. "I see you've moved." "Oh, yes, just to get out of the heat," the spider answered in her soft voice. "Let me see now. One over and one under, then down and back again, then all the way around." Little Toad heard her mutter to himself. He called goodbye, but Garden Spider didn't seem to hear him. She just went on counting and spinning. The spinach row was next, and Little Toad stopped to say hello to Stinkbug. "It's nice of you to stop, Little Toad. I don't have too many friends," Stinkbug complained. Then he cheered up. "But on the other hand, nobody bothers me much, especially in this hot spell." "Yes, I see what you mean," said Little Toad politely, trying not to breathe too deeply. "Well, I must be running along. I've got an important job to do." Click, click, click. Little Toad saw Click Beetle lying on his back in the dust between the squash plants. Each time the beetle made the clicking noise, he snapped up into the air. Each time he snapped, he landed on his back. Click. He snapped again. This time he landed on his feet. "Very good. A nice trick," Little Toad exclaimed as he rushed by. "It's not a trick. It's the only way I can get on my feet when I fall on my back," Click Beetle said. And it surprises away nosy birds," he called at Little Toad's retreating back. As he reached the edge of the garden, Little Toad caught sight of a big black crow in the old pine tree up ahead. His heart went bump, and he threw himself under a milkweed bush. He was just in time. A wicked black shadow swept across the place where Little Toad had been standing. He could hear the great black wings flapping overhead. He tried not to listen to the crow cry, "Caw, caw, caw." Little Toad stayed very still. He didn't blink an eye. When there was silence, Little Toad breathed to himself. "I'll just stay here a while." "Yes, do," a sweet voice in the bush above him said. "I'm Monique, and I'll let you know when the coast is clear." Little Toad was enchanted to see a beautiful striped caterpillar looking down at him. While he recovered from his terrible fright, he told Monique of his important mission to the pond. "Oh, your grandfather must be most desperately dry by now. You must hurry on. I can see it's safe to go now," Monique finally assured him. Looking carefully around, Little Toad scurried across the road. "Heidi-ho, Toady!" It was Grasshopper, who was balancing on the tip of a tall grass stem. Little Toad had his big red bandana out and was mopping his face. "Can't stop," he yelled. "Going to Green Pond. Water shortage." Grasshopper took a chew of tobacco. "Good luck," he shouted. His voice had a juicy, bubbly sound. Little Toad heard a great yawn, ho-hum. "Pardon me." He looked up and saw Cicada high up in the elm tree. "I've been asleep in the ground for 17 years, but I still can't seem to wake up," Cicada sighed. "Perhaps what I need is a little nap." "Don't let me keep you. I'm just passing through," Little Toad called up into the tree, but Cicada had already begun to hum her loud, buzzy hum. "That's nice, singing yourself to sleep," Little Toad said as he continued his journey. "Well, I'll have time for sleeping when I finish my important job." In the field ahead, Little Toad saw a fat, fuzzy, black at both ends and orangey brown in the middle caterpillar. "Woolly Bear, wait for me," Little Toad cried. "I'm going to get water for our shower at Green Pond," he said when he caught up with the caterpillar. "Don't bother me," grumped Woolly Bear. "My orangey brown stripe is narrower this year, so I'm getting set for a long winter. He hunched into the tall grass. Right now it looks like rain, he called back over his shoulder. Well, that is news, Little Toad exclaimed, looking up at the blue sky. We surely could use it. Little Toad passed some painted lady butterflies sipping from a thistle blossom in the meadow. Looks like a shower, ladies, he called to them. The butterflies waved their pretty wings at Little Toad and fluttered away across the meadow to another thistle. Rain is on the way, Woolly Bear said so, Little Toad yelled, but the painted ladies didn't listen to him. They went on sipping nectar in the sunshine. Little Toad told the weather news to a crowd of Japanese beetles. Their mouths were stuffed full of flower petals and they couldn't answer him. A thunderstorm is coming. Woolly Bear said so, he called to Bumblebee. It's too hot to talk, Bumblebee droned as he buzzed away. Woolly Bear says a hurricane is almost here, Little Toad told Rhinoceros Beetle. Phooey, Woolly Bear is full of hot air, the big beetle growled, shaking his black horns. He looked up at the burning sunlight, then fixed Little Toad with a stern glare. Little Toad hurried on with his buckets. On the hillside above Green Pond, Little Toad found Paper Wasp, chewing up a willow twig to repair her nest. Wasp moved the big wad of wet willow paper to one side of her mouth, then she spoke. A word of warning, my young friend, she said. The hornets are on the warpath again. Be on the lookout for them if you're going to the pond. Heaven knows what their trouble is. Little Toad watched her fly up to her nest with her mouth stuffed with paper. The little fellows are as mad as hornets, you might say, she called down in a muffled voice. Close to Green Pond, Little Toad passed Cricket, who was sitting at the foot of a wild grapevine. Cricket was practicing for his nightly concert. The smell of wild grapes and the sound of Cricket's music filled the warm air. Little Toad's arms were growing tired from carrying the buckets, but he knew he was almost there, so he straightened his shoulders and marched along humming Cricket's song. He didn't see the hornets coming, but he certainly heard them. They seemed to come from nowhere, and in an instant they were flying around him, sounding like 100 buzzsaws. In 4 big hops, Little Toad reached Green Pond. Buckets flying, he dove into the water with a mighty splash. Pretty soon Little Toad poked his big eyes out just above the water. He didn't see any hornets or hear any buzzing. He poked his head all the way out. The hornets had gone home. As the waves from his splash died down, Little Toad noticed everyone heading for the end of the pond. Pushing his buckets before him, he began to swim over there. The water felt deliciously cool and wet to his parched skin. As Little Toad reached the end of the pond, he saw green frogs and bullfrogs and tree frogs all lined up in a big long row. They were passing buckets of water along the row. As they worked, they chanted, yo-ho, heave-ho, yo-ho, heave-ho, in their deep, throaty voices. Little Toad leaped out of the water and ran down the row of frogs to see what they were doing. At the end of the row, he saw Ladybug and her children standing near their burning house. I shouldn't have left my iron on, Ladybug remarked sadly. Pour it on the kitchen. That's right, she directed the frogs. Oh, what would I do without you kind neighbors? I'll help too, cried Little Toad, and he joined the line of frogs. The kitchen was ablaze, and for a while it looked as if the fire would spread to the back porch. But finally the fire was drenched, and Little Toad rested with the exhausted firefighters, meanwhile telling them of his important mission. Everyone commented on how Little Toad looked like his father and grandfather, which made Little Toad puff up with pride. Then the frogs helped Little Toad fill up his buckets with water. We'll fill our buckets too and go along with you to water the garden, Little Toad, they cried. So each frog filled his bucket too, and they all left for the garden. Little Toad and the crowd of frogs made their way up the hill from Green Pond through the meadow over the road past the pine trees and into the vegetable garden. As Little Toad met his bug friends, he asked them to come to a party. Everyone said they would come. Everyone, that is, except Monique, whom Little Toad couldn't find. He looked all around her milkwood bush, but she wasn't there. He sat down under the bush to think. Just overhead he saw a pale green pod dangling from the underside of a leaf. He watched it turn this way and that in the gentle wind, and then he joined the crowd again. Old Toad was delighted to see Little Toad and all the frogs and all the buckets of water. He directed them to pour water on the plants and to fill the shower barrel. Little Toad, he said, you have done a fine job. Little Toad felt very proud. While the frogs were blowing up balloons and the other guests were hanging streamers, Little Toad wandered back to the milkweed plant with Grasshopper. All he saw was the same green pod on the leaf. Grasshopper knew what was happening at once. You see, Toady, he said, Monique hasn't gone away. She's in the pod, changing from a beautiful caterpillar into a beautiful butterfly. Don't be sad. She'll be out in about a week. But I wanted her to come to my party, Little Toad complained. Grasshopper understood. Well, maybe we can break off her leaf and take her along right in the pod, he suggested. She's asleep, but at least we'll have her with us. And that is what they did. So they had their party, and Monique was there. Everyone had a wonderful time, except that cicada dozed off just before the ice cream, and Click Beetle couldn't get right side up, but he ate strawberry upside-down cake and was perfectly happy. Finally, the party was over, but Little Toad liked it so much that he said, I know. Next week, let's have a coming-out party for Monique. Yes, yes, everyone cried, and they all went home to make their plans. Finally, Old Toad and Little Toad were alone with Monique. Old Toad was having an after-party snack. It's all a matter of timing, my boy, he said. Little Toad watched as Old Toad threw a peppermint into the air. Zap! Old Toad's sticky tongue shot out and caught the mint on its way down. He popped it into his big mouth faster than Little Toad could say zip. Just a matter of timing, Old Toad mumbled. Slowly his eyes closed. He began to snore. Little Toad watched a big drop of rain fall off the cabbage leaf. He smiled, remembering Woolly Bear's forecast, and gradually his eyes closed too. It had been a long day. And now for Chapter 2 of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. This chapter is titled, On Board the Dawn Treader. "Ah, there you are, Lucy," said Caspian. "We were just waiting for you. This is my captain, the Lord Drinian." A dark-haired man went down on one knee and kissed her hand. The only others present were Reepicheep and Edmund. "Where is Eustace?" asked Lucy. "In bed," said Edmund, "and I don't think we can do anything for him. It only makes him worse if you try to be nice to him." "Meanwhile," said Caspian, "we want to talk." "By Jove, we do," said Edmund, "and first about time. It's a year ago by our time since we left you just before your coronation. How long has it been in Narnia?" "Exactly 3 years," said Caspian. "All going well?" asked Edmund. "You don't suppose I'd have left my kingdom and put to sea unless all was well," answered the king. "It couldn't be better. There's no trouble at all now between telemarines, dwarfs, talking beasts, fauns, and the rest. And we gave those troublesome giants on the frontier such a good beating last summer that they pay us tribute now. And I had an excellent person to leave as regent while I'm away, Trumpkin the dwarf. You remember him?" "Dear Trumpkin," said Lucy. "Of course I do. You couldn't have made a better choice." "Loyal as a badger, ma'am, and valiant as a mouse," said Drinian. He had been going to say as a lion, but had noticed Reepicheep's eyes fixed on him. "And where are we heading for?" asked Edmund. "Well," said Caspian, "that's rather a long story. Perhaps you remember that when I was a child, my usurping uncle Miraz got rid of 7 friends of my father's who might have taken my part by sending them off to explore the unknown eastern seas beyond the Lone Islands." "Yes," said Lucy, "and none of them ever came back." "Right. Well, on my coronation day, with Aslan's approval, I swore an oath that if once I established peace in Narnia, I would sail east myself for a year and a day to find my father's friends, or to learn of their deaths and avenge them if I could. These were their names: the Lord Revillion, the Lord Byrne, the Lord Argaz, the Lord Mavramorn, the Lord Octesian, and the Lord Restamar, and, that other one who's so hard to remember. The Lord Roop, sire," said Drinian. "Roop, of course," said Caspian. "That is my main intention. But Reepicheep here has an even higher hope." Everyone's eyes turned to the mouse. "As high as my spirit," it said, "though perhaps as small as my stature. Why should we not come to the very eastern end of the world? And what might we find there? I expect to find Aslan's own country. It is always from the east, across the sea, that the great lion comes to us." "I say, that is an idea," said Edmund in an awed voice. "But do you think," said Lucy, "Aslan's country would be that sort of country? I mean, the sort you could ever sail to?" "I do not know, madam," said Reepicheep, "but there is this. When I was in my cradle, a wood woman, a dryad, spoke this verse over me: 'Where sky and water meet, where the waves grow sweet, doubt not, Reepicheep, to find all you seek. There is the utter east.' I do not know what it means, but the spell of it has been on me all my life." After a short silence, Lucy asked, "And where are we now, Caspian?" "The captain can tell you better than I," said Caspian, so Drinian got out his chart and spread it on the table. "That's our position," he said, laying his finger on it. "Or was at noon today. We had a fair wind from Cair Paravel and stood a little north for Galma, which we made on the next day. We were in port for a week, for the Duke of Galma made a great tournament for His Majesty, and there he unhorsed many knights. And got a few nasty falls myself, Drinian. Some of the bruises are still there," put in Caspian. "And unhorsed many knights," repeated Drinian with a grin. "We thought the Duke would have been pleased if the King's Majesty would have married his daughter, but nothing came of that." "Squints and has freckles," said Caspian. "Oh, poor girl," said Lucy. "And we sailed from Galma," continued Drinian, "and ran into a calm for the best part of 2 days and had to row. And then we had wind again and did not make Terabithia till the 4th day from Galma. And there their king sent out a warning not to land there for sickness in Terabithia. But we doubled the cape and put in at a little creek far from the city and watered. Then we had to lie off for 3 days before we got a southeast wind and stood out for 7 isles. The 3rd day out, a pirate, Terabinthian by her rig, overhauled us, but when she saw us well armed, she stood off after some shooting of arrows on either part. And we ought to have given her chase and boarded her and hanged every mother's son of them, said Reepicheep. And in 5 days more we were in sight of Moyle, which is, as you know, is the westernmost of the 7 isles. Then we rode through the straits and came about sundown into Red Haven on the Isle of Bren, where we were very lovingly feasted and had victuals and water at will. We left Red Haven 6 days ago and have made marvelously good speed, so that I hope to see the Lone Islands the day after tomorrow. The sum is, we are now nearly 30 days at sea and have sailed more than 400 leagues from Narnia. And after the Lone Islands, said Lucy. No one knows, your majesty, answered Drinian, unless the Lone Islanders themselves can tell us. They couldn't in our days, said Edmund. Then said Reepicheep, it is after the Lone Islands that the adventure really begins. Caspian now suggested that they might like to be shown over the ship before supper. But Lucy's conscience smote her and said, I think I really must go and see Eustace. Seasickness is horrid, you know. If I had my old cordial with me, I could cure him. But you have, said Caspian. I'd quite forgotten about it. As you left it behind, I thought it might be regarded as one of the royal treasures, and so I brought it. If you think it ought to be wasted on a thing like seasickness, it'll only take a drop, said Lucy. Caspian opened one of the lockers beneath the bench and brought out the beautiful little diamond flask, which Lucy remembered so well. Take back your own, Queen, he said. Then they left the cabin and went out into the sunshine. In the deck there were 2 large, long hatches, fore and aft of the mast, and both open, as they always were in fair weather, to let light and air into the belly of the ship. Caspian led them down a ladder into the after hatch. Here they found themselves in a place where benches for rowing ran from side to side, and the light came in through the oar holes and danced on the roof. Of course, Caspian's ship was not that horrible thing, a galley rowed by slaves. Oars were used only when wind failed or for getting in and out of harbor, and everyone except Reepicheep, whose legs were too short, had often taken a turn. At each side of the ship, the space under the benches was left clear for the rowers' feet. But all down the center there was a kind of pit which went down to the very keel, and this was filled with all kinds of things. Sacks of flour, casks of water and beer, barrels of porks, jars of honey, skin, bottles of wine, apples, nuts, cheeses, biscuits, turnips, sides of bacon. From the roof, that is, from under the side of the deck, hung hams and strings of onions, and also the men of the watch off duty in their hammocks. Caspian led them aft, stepping from bench to bench. At least it was stepping for him, and something between a step and a jump for Lucy, and a real long jump for Reepicheep. In this way they came to a partition with a door in it. Caspian opened the door and led them into a cabin which filled the stern underneath the deck cabins in the poop. It was, of course, not so nice. It was very low, and the sides sloped together as they went down so that there was hardly any floor. And though it had windows of thick glass, they were not made to open because they were underwater. In fact, at this very moment, as the ship pitched, they were alternately golden with sunlight and dim green with the sea. You and I must lodge here, Edmund, said Caspian. We'll leave your kinsman the bunk and sling hammocks for ourselves. I beseech your majesty, said Drinian. No, no, shipmate, said Caspian. We have argued all that out already. You and Reince was the mate, are sailing the ship, and will have cares and labors many a night when we are singing catches or telling stories. So you and he must have the port cabin above. King Edmund and I can lie very snug here below. But how is the stranger? Eustace, very green in the face, scowled and asked whether there was any sign of the storm getting less. But Caspian said, what storm? And Drinian burst out laughing. Storm, young master, he roared. This is as fair weather as a man could ask for. Who's that? Said Eustace irritably. Send him away. His voice goes through my head. I brought you something that will make you feel better, Eustace, said Lucy. Oh, go away and leave me alone, growled Eustace. But he took a drop from her flask, and though he said it was beastly stuff, the smell in the cabin when she opened it was delicious. It is certain that his face came the right color a few moments after he'd swallowed it, and he must have felt better because instead of wailing about the storm in his head, he began demanding to be put ashore, and said at the first port he would lodge a disposition against them all with the British consul. But when Reepicheep asked what a disposition was and how you lodged it, Reepicheep thought it was some new way of arranging a single combat. Eustace could only reply, fancy not knowing that. In the end, they succeeded in convincing Eustace that they were already sailing as fast as they could towards the nearest land they knew, and that they had no power of sending him back to Cambridge, which was where Uncle Harold lived, then of sending him to the moon. After that, he sulkily agreed to put on the fresh clothes which had been put out for him and come on deck. Caspian now showed them over the ship, though indeed they had seen most of it already. They went up on the forecastle and saw the lookout man standing on a little shelf inside the gilded dragon's neck and peering through its open mouth. Inside the forecastle was the galley, or ship's kitchen, and quarters for such people as the boatswain, the carpenter, the cook, and the master archer. If you think it odd to have the galley and the bows, and imagine the ship from its chimney streaming back over the ship, That is because you're thinking of a steamship where there is always a headwind. On a sailing ship, the wind is coming from behind, and anything smelly is put as far forward as possible. They were taken up to the fighting top, and at first it was rather alarming to rock to and fro there and see the deck looking small and far away beneath. You realized that if you fell, there was no particular reason why you should fall on board rather than in the sea. Then they were taken to the poop, where Reince was on duty with another man at the great tiller, and behind the Dragon's tail rose up, covered with gilding, and round inside it ran a little bench. The name of the ship was Dawn Treader. She was only a little bit of a thing compared with one of our ships, or even with the Cogs, Drummonds, Carracks, and Galleons, which Narnia had owned when Lucy and Edmund had reigned there under Peter as the High King, for nearly all navigation had died out in the reigns of Caspian's ancestors. When his uncle Miraz the Usurper had sent the Seven Lords to sea, they had to buy a Galmian ship and man it with hired Galmian sailors. But now Caspian had begun to teach the Narnians to be seafaring folk once more, and the Dawn Treader was the finest ship he had yet built. She was so small that forward of the mast there was hardly any deck room between the central hatch and the ship's boat on one side and the hen coop, Lucy fed the hens, on the other. But she was a beauty of a kind, a lady, as sailors say. Her lines perfect, her collars pure, and every spar and rope and pin lovingly made. Eustace, of course, would be pleased with nothing and kept on boasting about liners and motorboats and aeroplanes and submarines. As if he knew anything about them, muttered Edmund. But the other two were delighted with the Dawn Treader, and when they turned aft to the cabin and supper and saw the whole western sky lit up with an immense crimson sunset, and felt the quiver of the ship and tasted the salt on their lips, and thought of unknown lands on the eastern rim of the world, Lucy felt that she was almost too happy to speak. What Eustace thought had best be told in his own words, for when they had all got their clothes back dried next morning, he at once got out a little black notebook and a pencil and started to keep a diary. He always had this notebook with him and kept a record of his marks in it, for though he didn't care much about any subject for its own sake, he cared a great deal about marks and would even go to people and say, "I got so much, what did you get?" But as he didn't seem likely to get many marks on the Dawn Treader, he now started a diary. This was the first entry, 7 August. Have now been 24 hours on this ghastly boat, if it isn't a dream. All the time a frightful storm has been raging. It's a good thing I'm not seasick. Huge waves keep coming in over the front, and I've seen the boat nearly go under any number of times. All the others pretend to take no notice of this, either from swank or because Harold says one of the most cowardly things ordinary people do is to shut their eyes to facts. It's madness to come out into the sea in a rotten little thing like this, not much bigger than a lifeboat, and of course absolutely primitive indoors. No proper saloon, no radio, no bathrooms, no deck chairs. I was dragged all over it yesterday evening, and it would make anyone sick to hear Caspian showing off his funny little toy boat as if it was the Queen Mary. I tried to tell him what real ships are like, but he's too dense. E and L, of course, didn't back me up. I suppose a kid like L doesn't realize the danger, and E is buttering up C, as everyone does here. They call him a king. I said I was a Republican, but he had to ask me what that meant. He doesn't seem to know anything at all. Needless to say, I've been put in the worst cabin of the boat, a perfect dungeon, and Lucy has been given a whole room on deck to herself, almost a nice room compared with the rest of this place. C says that's because she's a girl. I tried to make him see what Alberta says, that all that sort of thing is really lowering girls, but he was too dense. Still, he might see that I shall be ill if I'm kept in that hole any longer. E says we mustn't grumble because C is sharing it with us himself to make room for L, as if that didn't make it more crowded and far worse. Nearly forgot to say that there is also a kind of mouse thing that gives everyone the most frightful cheek. The others can put up with it if they like, but I shall twist his tail pretty soon if he tries it on me. The food is frightful, too. The trouble between Eustace and Reepicheep arrived even sooner than might have been expected. Before dinner next day, when the others were sitting around the table waiting, being at sea gives one a magnificent appetite, Eustace came rushing in, wringing his hand and shouting out, "That little brute has half killed me. I insist on it being kept under control. I can bring an action against you, Caspian. I can order you to have it destroyed." At that same moment, Reepicheep appeared. His sword was drawn and his whiskers looked very fierce, but he was as polite as ever. "I ask your pardons all," he said, "and especially Her Majesty's. If I had known that he would take refuge here, I would have awaited a more reasonable time for his correction." "What on earth's up?" asked Edmund. What had really happened was this. Reepicheep, who never felt that the ship was getting on fast enough, loved to sit on the bulwarks far forward, just beside the Dragon's head, gazing out at the eastern horizon and singing softly in his little chirping voice the song the Dryad had made for him. He never held on to anything, however the ship pitched, and kept his balance with perfect ease. Perhaps his long tail hanging down to the deck inside the bulwarks made this easier. Everyone on board was so familiar with this habit, and the sailors liked it because when one was on lookout duty, it gave one somebody to talk to. Why exactly Eustace had slipped and reeled and stumbled all the way forward to the forecastle, he had not yet got his sea legs, I never heard. Perhaps he hoped he would see land, or perhaps he wanted to hang about the galley and scrounge something. Anyway, as soon as he saw that long tail hanging down, and perhaps it was rather tempting, he thought it would be delightful to catch hold of it, swing Reepicheep around by it once or twice upside down, then run away and laugh. At first, the plan seemed to work beautifully. The mouse was not much heavier than a very large cat. Eustace had him off the rail in a trice, and very silly he looked, thought Eustace, with his little limbs all splayed out and his mouth open. But unfortunately, Reepicheep, who had fought for his life many a time, never lost his head even for a moment, nor his skill. It is not very easy to draw one's sword when one is swinging around in the air by one's tail, but he did. And the next thing Eustace knew was two agonizing jabs in his hand, which made him let go of the tail. And the next thing after that was that the mouse had picked itself up again as if it were a ball bouncing off the deck. And there it was facing him, and a horrid, long, bright, sharp thing like a skewer was waving to and from within an inch of his stomach. This doesn't count as below the belt for mice in Narnia because they can hardly be expected to reach higher. Stop it, spluttered Eustace. Go away. Put that thing away. It's not safe. Stop it, I say. I'll tell Caspian. I'll have you muzzled and tied up. Why do you not draw your own sword, poltroon? Cheeped the mouse. Draw and fight, or I'll beat you black and blue with the flat. I haven't got one, said Eustace. I'm a pacifist. I don't believe in fighting. Do I understand, said Reepicheep, withdrawing his sword for a moment and speaking very sternly, that you do not intend to give me satisfaction? I don't know what you mean, said Eustace, nursing his hand. If you don't know how to take a joke, I shan't bother my head about you. Then take that, said Reepicheep, and that to teach you manners, and the respect due to a knight and a mouse, and a mouse's tail. And at each word he gave Eustace a blow with the side of his rapier, which was thin, fine, dwarf-tempered steel, and as supple and effective as a birch rod. Eustace, of course, was at a school where they didn't have corporal punishment, so the sensation was quite new to him. That was why, in spite of having no sea legs, it took him less than a minute to get off that forecastle and cover the whole length of the deck and burst in at the cabin door, still hotly pursued by Reepicheep. Indeed, it seemed to Eustace that the rapier as well as the pursuit was hot. It might have been red hot by the feel. There was not much difficulty in settling the matter once Eustace realized that everyone took the ideal of a duel quite seriously, and heard Caspian offering to lend him a sword, and Drinian and Edmund discussing whether he ought to be handicapped in some way to make up for his being so much bigger than Reepicheep. He apologized sulkily and went off with Lucy to have his hand bathed and bandaged, and then went... Okay, this is the third segment. Kelsey, I have a couple of books I want to read to you this time. This one is called No More Baths. One day when Jessie McWhistle came in for lunch, her dad gave her a kiss on the cheek and said, "Why, I believe you have a stalk of corn growing out of your ear, Jessie." "Pay no attention to him," said her big brother Bert. "You don't have any corn growing out of your ears. It isn't anything but a little bit of grass." That made Jessie mad. "You're teasing me," she said. "It's not right to give somebody a kiss just so you can look in their ears. I'm going to tell Mom." But her mom said that what she needed was a nice hot bath, and she went off to fill the tub. When Jessie heard the water running into the tub, she made up her mind to leave home. "I'm running away," she said. "Don't think I'm ever coming back because I've got friends and none of them ever has to take a bath in the middle of the day." "Send us a postcard," said her brother Bert. "Now listen here, young lady," said her dad. But Jessie didn't listen. She ran through the back door and down the path through the trees along the river. She hadn't gone far when she came to the sandy place where the sun shone all day long on the pigweed and pricker bushes. There was Mrs. Chicken, scratching in the sand and clucking to herself. "Hello, Jessie," said Mrs. Chicken. "Where are you off to?" "I've run away from home, Mrs. Chicken. I'm not going back because they make you take baths even in the middle of the day." "That's terrible," said Mrs. Chicken. "Why don't you come and live with me and be a chicken?" "I'd like that," said Jessie. "Will you show me how?" "I'll be glad to," said Mrs. Chicken. "The first thing I'll show you is how to frazzle." "How do you do that?" asked Jessie. "Watch me, Jessie," said Mrs. Chicken. "You find a nice dusty spot in the sun and squoosh down and ruffle up and shake sand all over your feathers," and Mrs. Chicken shook the sand out of her feathers like dust from a dust mop. It looked easy, so Jessie threw some sand in her hair and down the back of her neck. but no matter how hard she shook herself, she couldn't get the sand out. She itched and scratched all over. "Woo-wee," said Jessie. "How often does a chicken have to frazzle anyway? Just once to join, or is it something more regular than that?" "What did you say?" said Mrs. Chicken. "Just once. Chickens love to frazzle, Jessie. A chicken has to frazzle to keep clean." "I'm afraid I don't have the talent," said Jessie. "Don't let it fret you," said Mrs. Chicken. "Not just anybody can be a chicken. Why, frazzling is child's play compared to laying eggs." So Jessie said goodbye and went off down the path along the river through the trees. She hadn't gone far when she came to the old deserted mill. Who was sunning herself on the stone doorstep but Mrs. Cat? "Hello, Mrs. Cat," said Jessie. "Hello, Jessica," said Mrs. Cat. "Where are you off to?" "I've run away from home, Mrs. Cat, and I'm not ever going to go back because they make you take baths even in the middle of the day." "Baths?" said Mrs. Cat. "Cats never take baths." "Really?" said Jessie. "Do you think I could be a cat?" "I don't know," said Mrs. Cat. "I think you should spruce up a bit before we decide. Now watch closely. First you lick your paw and brush around your eyes and behind your ears." "Come on now," said Mrs. Cat. "Lick your paw, brush hard." Jessie tried. She licked the palm of her hand and rubbed her nose and behind her ears as hard as she could. But her hair didn't look clean and shiny like Mrs. Cat's. It was sticky and tangled. "Well," sighed Mrs. Cat, "I'm afraid you aren't meant to be a cat. But not just anybody can be a cat. Not just anybody, you understand, can catch mice." So Jessie McWhistle said goodbye and walked off down the path through the streets along the river. She hadn't gone far when she met Mrs. Pig. "Hello, Mrs. Pig," said Jessie. "Howdy do, Jessie," said Mrs. Pig. "Where are you off to?" "I've run away from home, Mrs. Pig, and I'm not ever going to go back because they make you take baths even in the middle of the day." "What's a bath?" asked Mrs. Pig. "A bath," said Jessie. "Why, that's when they throw you in a tub of boiling water and rub soap in your eyes." "Woof," said Mrs. Pig. "That sounds terrible. Why don't you come and live with me and be a pig?" "I'd like that," said Jessie, "but is it hard to be a pig?" "Pshaw," said Mrs. Pig. "Being a pig is the easiest and grandest thing in the world." So Jessie went off down the path with Mrs. Pig. They hadn't gone far when they came to a marshy place where a spring dribbled down and the mosquitoes hummed and sang. Mrs. Pig plowed into the biggest puddle she could find and sat down in the soft mud. "Come on in, Jessie," she called. "I'll show you how to get a nice even coat of mud. It will keep you cool." Mrs. Pig looked so comfortable that Jessie walked right down in and sat down. It did feel nice and cool. "What do pigs do now?" asked Jessie. "Well," said Mrs. Pig, "they generally take a nap and then go root for acorns." Mrs. Pig's voice began to get sleepy and she sighed dreamily. "And then we'll go and scratch on the fence for a while and then we'll go have some more acorns." Jessie began to feel wet and cold. She thought about peanut butter sandwiches and the smell of clean sheets hanging on the line in the sun. After a minute she got up. "Well," she said, "I can see that being a pig is a fine thing, but I don't think I'll start today." Mrs. Pig didn't say anything. She was fast asleep. Jessie walked up the path through the trees toward her own house. On her way she met her dad, who was bringing in the cows. "Welcome home, stranger," he said. "I'm glad you've decided to live with us for a while." But Jessie didn't say one word. Her brother Bert was peeling potatoes in the kitchen. "My goodness," he said, "you look like you fell in the hog wallah." Jessie still didn't say one word. She went upstairs to the bathroom and turned on the water in the tub and took off her clothes. Then she got in the tub. "Will you look at your scalp," said her mother, who came in to help her wash her hair. "It looks as if someone's been throwing in sand by the handful." When she was all clean, her mom wrapped her up in a big fluffy towel and gave her a hug. "There now," she said, "there are worse things than taking a bath, aren't there?" Jessie McWhistle knew the answer to that one. "Nope," she said, and that's that. Okay, the second book I want to read, Kelsey, is Walter the Wolf. You remember this because I think we used to have this one, or we used to read it. Once there was a wolf named Walter. He had horn-rimmed spectacles and two huge, perfectly matched fangs. And there was something else about Walter. He was perfect. Being perfect was hard work. Walter did everything his mother told him to do. He practiced his violin 2 hours a day, he took singing lessons, and he wrote poetry. And he never used his fangs on other animals or people. "Walter has the most unused fangs in the forest," everybody said, "and the biggest. Walter really should do something with his fangs." I like peace, said Walter. Andy smiled his two perfectly matched fangs smile. Nobody bites me, and I don't bite anybody. Walter is perfect, said his mother. One day Wyatt the fox, who lived in another forest, happened by. He saw Walter and his mother in front of their house. Walter was practicing his violin. Wyatt looked closely at Walter. Those are terrific fangs you have, he said. You really should do something with them. Walter went on practicing his violin. You really should exercise those teeth, said Wyatt. Everybody says that, said Walter, putting down his violin. I eat a lot of crunchy foods when I can find them. But you need something you can really sink your teeth into, said Wyatt, and I have an idea for both of us. With my brains and your fangs, we can't lose. Wyatt the fox, I don't trust you, said Walter's mother. But Walter said, maybe it will be easier than being perfect, mother. You can't be sure about that, Walter, she said, but maybe you should find out for yourself. She started to go into the house. Then she turned and said, Wyatt the fox, from the bottom of my heart, I don't trust you. After Walter's mother had left, Wyatt said to Walter, you and I are going into business, and the business is biting. My boy, you are going to be a professional biter, and I am going to be your manager. But I like peace, said Walter. Do you want to spend the rest of your life being perfect, asked Wyatt. Well, not exactly, said Walter. Wyatt wrote a sign and hung it from the branch of a large tree. The sign said, Walter the Wolf Incorporated. I bite. People, animals, anybody. My bite is worse than my bark. Reasonable fee. Walter looked at the sign. I don't know how to bark, he said. Still, it makes a very impressive sign, said Wyatt. Now, anyone who has an enemy and doesn't want to go after him can come to you to do it. One look at your fangs will convince them you can do a good piece of work, and you'll be performing a useful service, my boy. Yes, said Walter, and everybody will say, Walter's fangs have a job. When Walter's mother saw the sign, she said, Walter, you're making a terrible mistake. Biting is not for you. Playing the violin and biting don't mix. I have given up the violin, said Walter, for biting. Just this very morning you were perfect, said Walter's mother, shaking her head. Things change so fast in the forest. Walter was sorry that his mother didn't approve. He hoped she would change her mind. Walter sat under the tree with Wyatt, waiting for business. Soon Regina the beaver came along. She looked at the sign, then she looked at Walter's fangs. Then she said, my neighbor Naomi the beaver keeps taking my piles of wood. Can you help me? Sure, said Walter. First, I'll ask her to give back the wood. Then if she doesn't, I'll bite her. Regina looked at Walter's fangs again. I believe in you, she said. Walter rushed to Naomi's house. She was in her kitchen baking cakes. I've come to get back the piles of wood you took from Regina the beaver, he said. If you don't give them back, I'll bite you. If you bite me, I'll bite you back, said Naomi. You will? Said Walter. Yes, said Naomi. And she opened her mouth and showed two perfectly matched sharp front teeth. Don't you even want to run away from me? Asked Walter. No, said Naomi. You go away. I'm busy. What about the wood? Asked Walter. That wood is mine, said Naomi. It comes from my tree. Regina has her tree and I have my tree. She didn't tell me that, said Walter. Regina wants everyone's wood, said Naomi. Well, don't just stand there with your tongue hanging out. As long as you're here, I'll give you some of my cake. Walter sat down. So you're in the bite business, said Naomi as she gave Walter a piece of cake. I heard that you were a violin player. That was before I became a biter, said Walter. Did you know that before I became a biter, I was perfect? I wouldn't want to be perfect, and I wouldn't want to be a biter, said Naomi. Couldn't you think of something else to be? What else is there? Asked Walter. Oh, there are lots of things to choose from, said Naomi, if you use your head instead of your teeth. What do you know about anything, said Walter, hanging around a kitchen baking your cakes. Baking is good, clean work, said Naomi. Biting isn't. It hurts. So, said Walter. So, said Naomi. Suddenly she leaned toward Walter. I'm doing this for your own good, she said, and she sunk her two perfectly matched sharp front teeth into Walter's tail. Ow, you bit me, cried Walter. Ow, and he ran out of the house and into the forest. Eat and run, sighed Naomi, and she swept up some cake crumbs from her kitchen floor. Walter ran and ran. Ow, he cried, ow. He ran into Wyatt. What happened to you? Asked Wyatt. I got bitten, said Walter. You got bitten, said Wyatt. Impossible. Nobody bites Walter the wolf. Well, then Naomi is nobody, said Walter. Ow. Say, if she bites that well, maybe we could hire her for our business, said Wyatt. Our business, said Walter. There isn't any business. I quit. Biting hurts. But you could be the best biter in the forest, said Wyatt. You can't quit. Well, maybe just one bite, said Walter, and he sunk his fangs into Wyatt. Yow, cried Wyatt, you're dangerous, and he started to run, and he didn't stop until he was out of the forest. Just then, Walter's mother came along. What happened? She asked. I'm not a biter anymore, Mother, said Walter, and I'm not perfect either. That's all right, said Walter's mother. Nobody's perfect forever. You lasted a long time. Now let's go into the house and rest. In just a minute, said Walter. He ran to the big tree where Wyatt the fox had hung the sign. He reached up and pulled it down. He crossed out the words and wrote new ones. Then he hung the sign back up on the tree. The sign read, Walter the Wolf, I have big fangs. I did not choose them, but I can choose not to use them. Walter the Wolf. Then Walter went into his house and soaked his tail. Okay, this is chapter 3 of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. This is titled The Lone Islands. Land in sight, shouted the man in the bows. Lucy, who had been talking to Reince on the poop, came pattering down the ladder and raced forward. As she went, she was joined by Edmund, and they found Caspian, Drinian, and Reepicheep already on the forecastle. It was a coldish morning, the sky very pale and the sea very dark blue, with little white caps of foam, and there, a little way off on the starboard bow, was the nearest of the lone islands, Philomath, like a low green hill in the sea, and behind it further off, the gray slopes of its sister, Dorn. Same old Philomath, same old Dorn, said Lucy, clapping her hands. Oh, Edmund, how long it is since you and I saw them last. I've never understood why they belong to Narnia, said Caspian. Did Peter the High King conquer them? Oh, no, said Edmund. They were Narnian before our time, in the days of the White Witch. By the way, I have never yet heard how these remote islands became attached to the crown of Narnia. And if I ever do, and if the story is at all interesting, I may put it in some other book. Are we to put in here, sire? Asked Drinian. I shouldn't think it would be much good landing on Philomath, said Edmund. It was almost uninhabited in our days, and it looks as if it was the same still. The people live mostly on Dorn and a little on Avra. That's the third one, and you can't see it yet. They only kept sheep on Philomath. Then we'll have to double that cape, I suppose, said Drinian, and land on Dorn. That'll mean rowing. I'm sorry we're not landing on Philomath, said Lucy. I'd like to walk there again. It was so lonely, a nice kind of loneliness, and all grass and clover and soft sea air. I'd love to stretch my legs too, said Caspian. I'll tell you what. Why shouldn't we go ashore in the boat and send it back, and then we could walk across Philomath and let the Dawn Treader pick us up on the other side. If Caspian had been as experienced then as he became later on in this voyage, he would not have made this suggestion. But at the moment it seemed an excellent one. Oh, do let's, said Lucy. You'll come, will you, said Caspian to Eustace, who had come on deck with his hand bandaged. Anything to get off this blasted boat, said Eustace. Blasted, said Drinian. How do you mean? In a civilized country like where I come from, said Eustace, the ships are so big that when you're inside you wouldn't know you were at sea at all. In that case you might just as well stay ashore, said Caspian. Will you tell them to lower the boat, Drinian? The king, the mouse, the two Pevensies, and Eustace all got into the boat and were pulled to the beach of Philomath. When the boat had left them and was being rowed back, they all turned and looked round. They were surprised at how small the Dawn Treader looked. Lucy was, of course, barefoot, having kicked off her shoes while swimming, but that is no hardship if one is going to walk on downy turf. It was delightful to be ashore again and to smell the earth and grass, even if at first the ground seemed to be pitching up and down like a ship, as it usually does for a while if one has been at sea. It was much warmer here than it had been on board, and Lucy found the sand pleasant to her feet as they crossed it. There was a lark singing. They struck inland and up a fairly steep though low hill. At the top, of course, they looked back, and there was the Dawn Treader shining like a great bright insect and crawling slowly northwestward with her oars. Then they went over the ridge and could see her no longer. Dorn now lay before them, divided from Philomath by a channel about a mile wide. Behind it and to the left lay Avra. The little white town of Narrowhaven on Dorn was easily seen. Hello, what's this? Said Edmund suddenly. In the green valley to which they were descending, 6 or 7 rough-looking men, all armed, were sitting by a tree. Don't tell them who we are, said Caspian. And pray, your majesty, why not? Said Reepicheep, who had consented to ride on Lucy's shoulder. It just occurred to me, replied Caspian, that no one here can have heard from Narnia for a long time. It's just possible they may not still acknowledge our overlordship, in which case it might not be quite safe to be known as the king. We have our swords, sire, said Reepicheep. Yes, Reep, I know we have, said Caspian. But if it is a question of reconquering the 3 islands, I'd prefer to come back with a rather larger army. By this time they were quite close to the strangers, one of whom, a big black-haired fellow, shouted out, "A good morning to you." "And a good morning to you," said Caspian. "Is there still a governor of the Lone Islands?" "To be sure there is," said the man, "Governor Gumpus. His sufficiency is at Narrowhaven, but you'll stay and drink with us?" Caspian thanked him, though neither he nor the others much liked the look of their new acquaintance, and all of them sat down. But hardly had they raised their cups to their lips when the black-haired man nodded to his companions, and as quick as lightning, all the 5 visitors found themselves wrapped in strong arms. There was a moment's struggle, but all the advantages were on one side, and soon everyone was disarmed and had their hands tied behind their backs, except Reepicheep writhing in his captor's grip and fighting furiously. "Careful with that beast, Tax," said the leader. "Don't damage him. He'll fetch the best price of the lot, I shouldn't wonder." "Coward, poltroon," squeaked Reepicheep. "Give me my sword and free my paws if you dare." "Whew," whistled the slave merchant, for that is what he was. "It can talk. Well, I never did. Blowed if I'd take less than 200 crescents for him. The Calorman crescent, which is the chief coin in those parts, is worth about 1/3 of a pound." "So that's what you are," said Caspian, "a kidnapper and slaver. I hope you're proud of it." Now, said the slaver, "don't you start any jaw. The easier you take it, the pleasanter all around, see? I don't do this for fun. I've got my living to make, same as anyone else." "Where will you take us?" asked Lucy, getting the words out with some difficulty. "Over to Narrowhaven," said the slaver, "for market day tomorrow." "Is there a British consul there?" asked Eustace. "Is there a which?" said the man. But long before Eustace was tired of trying to explain, the slaver simply said, "Well, I've had enough of this jabber. The mouse is a fair treat, but this one would talk the hind leg off a donkey. Off we go, mates." Then the 4 human prisoners were roped together, not cruelly, but securely, and made to march down the shore. Reepicheep was carried. He had stopped biting on a threat of having his mouth tied up. But he had a great deal to say, and Lucy really wondered how any man could bear to have the things said to him which were said to the slave dealer by the mouse. But the slave dealer, far from objecting, only said, "Go on," whenever Reepicheep paused for breath, occasionally adding, "It's as good as a play," or "Blimey, you can't help almost thinking it knows what it's saying," or "Was it one of you what trained it?" This so infuriated Reepicheep that in the end, the number of things he thought of saying all at once nearly suffocated him, and he became silent. When they got down to the shore that looked towards Dorne, they found a little village and a longboat on the beach, and lying a little further out, a dirty, bedraggled-looking ship. "Now, youngster," said the slave dealer, "let's have no fuss, and then you'll have nothing to cry about. All aboard." At that moment, a fine-looking, bearded man came out of one of the houses, an inn, I think, and said, "Well, Pug, more of your usual wares?" The slaver, whose name seemed to be Pug, bowed very low and said in a wheedling kind of voice, "Yes, please, your lordship." "How much do you want for that boy?" asked the other, pointing to Caspian. "Ah," said Pug, "I knew your lordship would pick on the best. No deceiving your lordship with anything second-rate. That boy, now, I've taken a fancy to him myself. Got kind of fond of him, I have. I'm that tender-hearted. I didn't ever ought to have taken up this job. Still, to a customer like your lordship." "Tell me your price, carrion," said the lord sternly. "Do you think I want to listen to the rigmarole of your filthy trade?" 300 crescents, my lord, to your honorable lordship. But to anyone else, I give you 150. "Oh, please, please," broke in Lucy, "don't separate us, whatever you do. You don't know." But then she stopped, for she saw that Caspian didn't even now want to be known. 150 then," said the lord. "As for you, little maiden, I'm sorry I cannot buy you all. Unrope my boy, Pug, and look, treat these others well while they're in your hands, or it'll be the worse for you." "Well," said Pug, "now who ever heard of a gentleman in my way of business who treated his stock better than what I do? Why, I treat 'em like my own children." "That's likely enough to be true," said the other grimly. The dreadful moment had now come. Caspian was untied, and his new master said, "This way, lad," and Lucy burst into tears, and Edmund looked very blank. But Caspian looked over his shoulder and said, "Cheer up, I'm sure it will come all right in the end. So long." "Now, missy," said Pug, "don't you start taking on and spoiling your looks for the market tomorrow. You be a good girl, and then you won't have nothing to cry about, see?" Then they were rowed out to the slave ship and taken below into a long, rather dark place, none too clean, where they found many other unfortunate prisoners. For Pug was, of course, a pirate, and had just returned from cruising among the islands and capturing what he could. The children didn't meet anyone whom they knew. The prisoners were mostly Galmians and Terabinthians. And there they sat in the straw and wondered what was happening to Caspian, tried to stop Eustace talking as if everyone except himself was to blame. Meanwhile, Caspian was having a much more interesting time. The man who had bought him led him down a little lane between two of the village houses and so out into an open place behind the village. Then he turned and faced him. "You needn't be afraid of me, boy," he said. "I'll treat you well. I bought you for your face. You reminded me of someone." "May I ask of whom, my lord?" said Caspian. "You remind me of my master, King Caspian of Narnia." And Caspian decided to risk everything on one stroke. "My lord," he said, "I am your master. I am Caspian, King of Narnia." "You make very free," said the other. "How shall I know this is true?" "Firstly, by my face," said Caspian. "Secondly, because I know within 6 guesses who you are. You are one of those 7 lords of Narnia whom my uncle Miraz sent to sea, and whom I have come out to look for. Argos, Bern, Octesian, Restamar, Mavramor, or I have forgotten the others. And finally, if your lordship will give me a sword, I will prove on any man's body in clean battle that I am Caspian, the son of Caspian, lawful king of Narnia, lord of Cair Paravel, and emperor of the Lone Islands." "By heaven," exclaimed the man, "it is his father's very voice and trick of speech. My liege, your majesty." And there in the field he knelt and kissed the king's hand. "The moneys your lordship dispersed for our person will be made good from our own treasury," said Caspian. "They're not in Pug's purse yet, sire," said the Lord Bern, for he it was, "and never will be, I trust. I have moved his sufficiency the governor 100 times to crush this vile traffic in man's flesh." "My Lord Bern," said Caspian, "we must talk of the state of these islands, but first, what is your lordship's own story?" "Short enough, sire," said Bern. "I came thus far with my 6 fellows, loved the girl of the islands, and felt I had had enough of the sea. And there was no purpose in returning to Narnia while your majesty's uncle held the reins. So I married, and have lived here ever since." "And what is this governor, this Gumpus, like? Does he still acknowledge the king of Narnia for his lord?" "In words, yes. All is done in the king's name. But he would not be best pleased to find a real live king of Narnia coming in upon him. And if your majesty came before him alone and unarmed, well, he would not deny his allegiance, but he would pretend to disbelieve you. Your grace's life would be in danger. What following has your majesty in these waters?" "There's my ship just rounding the point," said Caspian. "We are about 30 swords if it came to fighting. Shall we not have my ship in and fall upon Pug and free my friends whom he holds captive?" "Not by my counsel," said Bern. "As soon as there was a fight, 2 or 3 ships would put out from Narrowhaven to rescue Pug. Your majesty must work by a show of more power than you really have, and by the terror of the king's name. It must not come to plain battle. Grumpus is a chicken-hearted man and can be overawed." After a little more conversation, Caspian and Bern walked down to the coast a little west of the village, and there Caspian winded his horn. This was not the great magic horn of Narnia, Queen Susan's horn. He had left that at home for his regent Trumpkin to use if any great need fell upon the land in the king's absence. Drinian, who was on the lookout for a signal, recognized the royal horn at once, and the Dawn Treader began standing in to shore. Then the boat put off again, and in a few moments Caspian and Lord Bern were on deck explaining the situation to Drinian. He, just like Caspian, wanted to lay the Dawn Treader alongside the slave ship at once and board her, but Bern made the same objection. "Steer straight down this channel, Captain," said Bern, "and then round to Avra, where my own estates are. But first, run up the king's banner, hang out all the shields, and send as many men to the fighting top as you can. And about 5 bow shots hence, when you get open sea on your port bow, run up a few signals." "Signals? To whom?" said Drinian. "Why, to all the other ships we haven't got, but which it might be well that Gumpus thinks we have." "Oh, I see," said Drinian, rubbing his hands. "And they'll read our signals. What shall I say? Whole fleet round the south of Avra and assemble at Bernstead," said the Lord Bern. "That'll do excellently. Their whole journey, if there were any ships, would be out of sight from Narrowhaven." Caspian was sorry for the others languishing in the hold of Pug's slave ship, but he could not help finding the rest of that day enjoyable. Late in the afternoon, for they had to do all by oar, having turned to starboard round the northeast end of Doorn and poured again around the point of Avra, they entered into a good harbor on Avra's southern shore, where Bern's pleasant land sloped down to the water's edge. Bern's people, many of whom they saw working in the fields, were all free men, and it was a happy and prosperous fife. Here they all went ashore and were royally feasted in a low, pillared house overlooking the bay. Bern and his gracious wife and merry daughters made them good cheer. But after dark, Bern sent a messenger over by boat to Doorn to order some preparations. He did not say exactly what, for the following day. And that's the end of chapter 3. Okay, Kelsey, these next 2 books are for you. This one is called Not This Bear. Little Herman went to visit his Aunt Gert. He got off the bus at the last stop, but he still had a short walk to her house. It was very, very cold. And to keep warm, Herman pulled himself deeper inside his long, furry coat. And he pulled his big, furry hat down over his face. He looked just like a bear, which is funny, because that is exactly what a passing bear thought he looked like. "You must be my cousin Julius," said the bear. Grabbing Herman by the hand, the bear ran with him to his cave. "Look who I found at the edge of the woods," he shouted. All the bears ran over and kissed Herman hard and wet. Cousin Julius," they shouted. "My name is Herman," said Herman, but no one even heard. They were so excited. "I'm not a bear," Herman said. "Dinner is ready," Mama Bear called. "Take your places. Cousin Julius, you sit here." When Mama Bear served the soup, all the bears lapped it up with their tongues, but not Herman. He ate politely with a spoon that he happened to have in his pocket. And when the vegetables were served, Herman ate with a fork that he happened to have in his pocket. The bears were amazed. My, Big Brown Bear stared at Herman. "How smart you are to learn a trick like that." And all the bears clapped as if they were watching a circus act. Poor Herman. He wasn't a bear. He was a little boy. He was sure of it. But the bears were just as sure that Herman was their cousin Julius. So, thought Herman, I'll just prove I'm really a boy. He began to sing and dance and whistle and tie his shoelace and stand on his head. All the things a boy knows how to do. But whatever he did, the bears still thought Herman was a bear. And they clapped even harder at his tricks. "See what happens," said Papa, "when a bear has a chance to go to the big city and learn a trade?" "What a clever cousin we have," said Big Brown Bear, and he yawned and went outside. Big Brown Bear looked at the sky and announced the time of year, winter. "After Mama's big meal, we won't have to eat again until spring," he said, and all the bears got ready to sleep. "Remember, we sleep for at least 2 months," said Big Brown Bear. 2 months, said Herman. "I only sleep one night at a time. During the day, I go out and play. I'm not sleeping through the winter." "But all bears do," said a baby bear. "Not this bear," answered Herman. "I like winter," he said. "He likes winter?" said the bears, astonished. "Yes, I like winter. I like to go sledding and to skate. I like to make snowmen and drink hot cocoa with whipped cream. I like snowball fights with my friends, and I like to make giant tracks in the snow. And besides, I have to go to school." When Herman finished speaking, there was a long silence. The Big Brown Bear spoke. "Perhaps you aren't a bear after all. In fact, now that I look closer, you don't even have a nose like a bear." "Look," shouted a bear, removing Herman's furry hat and coat. "He's not a bear at all." And there, shivering in the cave, stood little Herman. "See, I am a boy," he said. Papa Bear roared with laughter. "That's the best trick of all, and the trick was on us." Herman put on his furry hat and coat again. He said goodbye to all the bears. "Come and visit us in spring," they yawned after him. "I will," he answered, just to be polite. And Herman began to walk toward Aunt Gert's house. He was almost out of the woods when a big, black, burly bear jumped out from behind a tree. Running toward Herman, the bear shouted, "Cousin Bernard, Cousin Bernard!" But Herman ran just as fast as he could out of the woods. Herman was glad when he finally reached Aunt Gert's porch, and Aunt Gert was very glad to see Herman. This one is called Farmer Schultz's Ducks. In the hills of South Australia, there is a little river with a big name, the Onkaparinga. It flowed through a valley full of apple trees and cabbage patches, pastures and gardens, red gum trees and poplars. In springtime, blossoms fell like confetti as if the hills were having a wedding, and there was celery on the breath of the wind. In autumn, the willows bowed down by the river, their branches like arches of gold. And in winter, the tall trees whipped the air and the wind and the rain and the high water, and the river went fussing and gurgling on its crooked way. A narrow road wound down the valley. Sometimes it ran by the side of the river, and sometimes it veered away. And it ran right past the front gate of Farmer Schultz's farm, between his house and the Onkaparinga River. Farmer Schultz was a busy man, and his farm was a busy place. There were cows in the paddocks, there were geese on the pastures and goats on the hillsides. There were pear trees and apple, carrots and cucumbers, berries and bacon. There were furrows combed out for potatoes and trellises like wigwams for beans. The beams of the cellar were loaded with German sausage, and the shelves held dishes of scalded cream. And in the yard at the back of the house, there were more than 50 ducks. Farmer Schultz's ducks were the most beautiful in the world. There were brown ducks and gray ducks and speckled ducks. There were ducks with necks of opal and wings of amethyst. Their colors gleamed in the sunlight. Their feathers shone like jewels. There were ducks with the sheen of emerald, of sapphire and turquoise and jasper, like the glint of Aladdin's treasure. There were ducks like burnished gold. There were drakes as well, brown drakes, mottled drakes, muddy drakes, drakes with eyes like night and bills like scoops. There were great white drakes with noses redder than roses, and ducklings as tiny as tennis balls and as soft as clusters of golden wattle when it bloomed on the hills by the Onkaparinga River. Every morning after breakfast, Farmer Schultz opened the backyard gate so that the ducks could go down to the river. They took their time, even when they were in a hurry, to reach the water. They held their heads high and waddled with dignity, even though they had to jostle each other when they went through the gate. The ducklings hurried to line up behind their mothers. They went quickly down the drive by the side of the house and poured out across the road on their way to the Onkaparinga River. Sometimes a car would go by, or a trailer loaded high with meadow hay, or a tractor coughing in the frosty morning air. The drivers always stopped, because everyone knew that the ducks had the right of way. All day long, the ducks swam in the pools of the peaceful and weedy river. They explored the reeds and tugged at the water weeds and dug at the muddy banks. They floated like petals and sailed like boats with their webbed feet paddling hard. They waddled onto shore and blinked their eyes and used their bills like spades. But at sunset, they all went home. For when the shadows deepened and the valley was blue with haze, there were nasty things by the side of the Onkaparinga River. There were wild cats with eyes like ice and claws like steel. There were slinking foxes as crafty as serpents and as silent as falling dew. And there were hunters with shotguns. So the drakes led the way back home, and the ducks and the ducklings hurried along in line. Farmer Schultz was proud of their wisdom. Good boys, he said to the drakes. Good girls, good little children, he said to the ducks and ducklings. Now safe from the fox you will be. Now we all in peace can sleep. As the years went by, the number of people grew. The city beyond the hills became as fat as a big balloon. More houses were built in the valley by the side of the gentle river, and lines of cars like streams of beads went racing down the road. They raced away in the morning and they raced back in the evening. The drivers were always late. They blew their horns and shouted loudly and rudely and accelerated much too quickly. Sometimes they didn't even stop for the ducks. One Christmas Eve, a drake was run over and had to be added to the Christmas dinner. Farmer Schultz was red with rage. We must this nonsense stop, he cried. We must put up a big notice for the ducks. And he called his family together to think of the right words. Ducks coming here, he wrote. But Farmer Schultz's son Hans laughed and said it wasn't even English. Crossing ducks, suggested Gretchen. Some liked that, but others did not. Ducks cross here, ventured Adolf, but his mother said that people would think it was a place for angry ducks. Stop for ducks, suggested Helga, but Hans said it would make everyone think there were ducks for sale. 4-year-old Anna, who was rolling breadcrumbs into a ball, looked up suddenly. Why don't you say ducks crossing, she asked, because that's what they're always doing. Wonderful, said her father. You are smarter than Einstein, Anna. Great, said Gretchen. Brilliant, said Hans. And so Anna's sign was painted and nailed to a post by the side of the road. The sign was not a success. Some cars stopped, but others did not. This made the crossing more dangerous than ever. And then one morning there was a terrible accident. A truck slowed down when the ducks were coming from Farmer Schultz's drive, but not the driver who came racing along behind it. He swerved out of his lane without even seeing if the way was clear. He accelerated to pass the truck. He drove headlong into the waddling ducks. Crash! There were shouts and cries and squealing tires. There were gabbles and quacks and flying feathers. 4 ducks had concussions and had to be nursed in a box beside the kitchen fire. 2 drakes had broken legs and had to wear splints for months, and 3 little ducklings were dead. Anna buried them beside the lettuce. Farmer Schultz's face was the color of one of his favorite ducks, mottled in blue and purple with anger. Lunatic, he shouted, silly person. Give up, said Hans. Sell the ducks before all of them are killed. Never, answered Farmer Schultz furiously. Never, never. Then build a house on the other side of the road. Build a house by the river. Never. Why for should I move my house when it is not my fault? Then we better teach them to fly, said Anna. They can't cross the road anymore unless they go over the top. Farmer Schultz opened his eyes wide. Over the top. Of course. He slapped his hand on his thigh. You are smarter than Einstein, Anna. From now on, the ducks will go over the top. Hans was flabbergasted. How are you going to manage that, he asked. His father's mind was running at a feverish pitch. With a bridge, of course. Then the people can drive like lunatics if they want. My ducks will be safe. They will go over the top. He brought 2 tall poles and put them up beside his drive, about 3 feet apart. Then he put another 2 by the fence on the riverside. And between them he slung the trunks of 2 long pine trees like beams more than 12 feet above the road. An overpass with safety fences of wire mesh at the sides and 2 long ramps at the ends for the ducks to walk up and down. Before long, the ducks knew the way. When they came out of their yard, they went straight to the ramp. Then, with waddling feet and quacking, they hurried up and across and down. It was a wonderful sight, a procession of ducks against the sky. Before long, the cars were all stopping to watch them. Even the drivers who had no time for the ducks on the ground now stopped to watch them pass overhead. Soon the bridge of ducks was famous. People came in carloads. They came with cameras and they posed for pictures with a line of ducks behind them. They trampled the grass like buffaloes. Poor Farmer Schultz was beside himself. Then disaster struck on the 1st of March. The ducks were coming out of the Onkaparinga River and waddling toward the ramp. Farmer Schultz had just stopped his tractor and was stretching his weary arms. At that very moment, a monstrous semi-trailer came roaring around the bends of the narrow road. The driver was new to the valley and he was late with his goods for the city. He was driving too fast. He was tired and sleepy. And his load was too high for the bridge. The ducks were waddling across the overpass, hurrying and quacking as they went. The semi-trailer came roaring around the corner like a cyclone. It struck the bridge at the center, shattering the beams like matchsticks. The ducks were flung like flotsam, backward, forward, upward, sideways, trumpeting and shrieking. Some landed back in the river, some flew, some fell, some leaped. Some were hurled along the side of the road, some even into their own backyard. Some were unharmed, some were hurt, and some were dead. It took a long time for Farmer Schultz to recover from the shock. He had to clear away the wreckage of the bridge, he had to breed more ducks, and he was in trouble with the government for building an overpass without permission. You can't build bridges wherever you like, the government said. There could have been a terrible accident. There was a terrible accident, Farmer Schultz said angrily. Once more there was a family meeting. Give up, said Hans. Get rid of the duck while you can. Never, answered his father. The ducks are part of the family. They are like brothers and sisters nearly. But how in the world are they going to cross the road? They have to go to the water. We must all think, his father said. We must all think hard. There's no point in building another bridge, Hans said. It will simply be smashed again. Little Anna had come home from kindergarten and was busy rolling breadcrumbs as usual. Why don't you have a pipe, she said, so the ducks can cross under the road? There was silence for a while, and then the others raised their eyebrows in amazement. Wonderful, exclaimed her mother. Brilliant, cried Hans. By golly, Anna, you are smarter than Einstein, shouted her father with eyes as wide as an owl's. This time Farmer Schultz was going to do it right. He wrote an official letter to the government. He drew up a plan for everyone to see. He went from one building to another building, from one floor to another floor, from one person to another person. He had to fill in one form and another form and wait in one room and another room. It was almost more than Farmer Schultz could bear, just to put a duck pipe underneath the road, for nobody had ever heard of such a thing before. There were water pipes and sewer pipes and drain pipes and fuel pipes. There were cable pipes and steam pipes and oil pipes and gas pipes. There were copper pipes and steel pipes, plastic pipes and concrete pipes, and 100 other pipes beside, but nowhere had there ever been a duck pipe before. A duck pipe, they laughed. You must be joking. Farmer Schultz was red with anger and blue with impatience and purple with frustration. It's no joke, he roared. My ducks are never joking. But the government told him to go home quietly and wait. Farmer Schultz waited. He milked his cows and planted potatoes and picked apples, and he bred more ducks. And at last, after waiting for 12 months and 23 days, Farmer Schultz was allowed to build his pipe. It was a beautiful pipe, 3 feet in diameter and 180 feet long. It went under the ground at the side of the house, and it came out near the bank of the gently flowing Onkaparinga River. Farmer Schultz built flaps of wire mesh at each end to guide the ducks in. They hustled and quacked at first, trying to learn the way. Farmer Schultz shooed and Mrs. Schultz shushed. Hans and Gretchen and Helga and Adolf held out their arms and flapped, and little Anna clapped her hands when at last the ducks went through. Everyone kissed her and said she was smarter than Einstein to think of a plan like that. After that, there was peace at last. All day long, the ducks lazed by the riverside, listening to the secrets of the earth and the words of the running water. They could hear the grass growing and the small seeds stretching and the earthworms moving under the ground. They snoozed in the sunshine with their heads tucked under or floated on the river as softly as blossoms. Shortly afterward, one of Farmer Schultz's friends carved a life-size duck from a piece of marble and placed it on a pillar of stone by the side of the road. Then he carved 2 words in the stone for all to see: Duckdorf, the village of ducks. Farmer Schultz looked at it and grinned. He was as happy and contented as he had ever been. That year, Farmer Schultz won 3 blue ribbons at the show and a grand champion medal for a flinty-eyed drink. He was proud as a peacock and as boastful as a fisherman. My ducks, he said loudly, are the best and the smartest in the whole wide world. The ducks were contented too. It was wonderful to see them streaming out of the pipe in the morning like ants coming out of the ground, and to watch them hurrying back in the evening like beetles bound for their burrows. In the summer, the pipe gave them shelter from the heat. In winter, when the rain poured down and the water swept out of the pipe in a torrent, they came skidding and skiing, swimming and splashing in a wild, rollicking rush, a waterfall of ducks. In the spring, they came out into a magic land that was white with blossom, and in autumn they waddled out onto a carpet of golden leaves. They are still there now, dwaddling and dabbling happily where the willows arch and sway by the banks of the beautiful Onkaparinga River. This is from The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Chapter 4. It's titled, What Caspian Did There. Next morning, the Lord Bern called his guests early, and after breakfast he asked Caspian to order every man he had into full armor. And above all, he added, let everything be as trim and scoured as if it were the morning of the first battle in a great war between noble kings with all the world looking on. This was done, and then in 3 boatloads, Caspian and his people, and Bern with a few of his, put out for Narrowhaven. The king's flag flew in the stern of his boat, and his trumpeter was with him. When they reached the jetty at Narrowhaven, Caspian found a considerable crowd assembled to meet them. This is what I sent word about last night, said Bern. They are all friends of mine and honest people. And as soon as Caspian stepped ashore, the crowd broke out into hurrahs and shouts of, Narnia, Narnia, long live the king. At the same moment, and this was also due to Bern's messengers, bells began ringing from many parts of the town. Then Caspian caused his banner to be advanced and his trumpet to be blown, and every man drew his sword and set his face into joyful sternness, and they marched up the street so that the street shook and their armor shone, for it was a sunny morning, so that one could hardly look at it steadily. At first, the only people who cheered were those who had been warned by Bern's messenger and knew what was happening and wanted it to happen. But then all the children joined in because they liked a procession and had seen very few. And then all the schoolboys joined in because they also liked processions and felt that the more noise and disturbance there was, the less likely they would be to have any school that morning. And then all the old women put their heads out of doors and windows and began chattering and cheering because it was a king, and what is a governor compared with that? And all the young women joined in for the same reason, and also because Caspian and Drinian and the rest were so handsome. And then all the young men came to see what the young women were looking at, so that by the time Caspian reached the castle gates, nearly the whole town was shouting. And where Gumpus sat in the castle, muddling and messing about with accounts and forms and rules and regulations, he heard the noise. At the castle gate, Caspian's trumpeter blew a blast and cried, Open for the king of Narnia, come to visit his trusty and well-beloved servant, the governor of the Lone Islands. In those days, everything in the islands was done in a slovenly, slouching manner. Only the little postern opened, and out came a tousled fellow with a dirty old hat on his head instead of a helmet, and a rusty old pike in his hand. He blinked at the flashy figures before him. Carn sees sufficiency, he mumbled, which was his way of saying you can't see his sufficiency. No interviews without appointments except between 9 and 10 p.m., second Saturday every month. Uncover before Narnia, you dog, thundered the Lord Bern, and dealt him a rap with his gauntleted hand, which sent his hat flying from his head. Here, what's it all about? Began the doorkeeper, but no one took notice of him anymore. 2 of Caspian's men stepped through the postern, and after some struggling with bars and bolts, for everything was rusty, flung both wings of the gate wide open. Then the king and his followers strode into the courtyard. Here a number of the governor's guards were lounging about, and several more, they were mostly wiping their mouths, came tumbling out of various doorways. Though their armor was in a disgraceful condition, these were fellows who might have fought if they had been led or had known what was happening. So this was the dangerous moment. Caspian gave them no time to think. Where's the captain, he asked. I am, more or less, if you know what I mean, said a languid and rather dandified young person without any armor at all. It is our wish, said Caspian, that our royal visitation to our realm of the Lone Islands should, if possible, be an occasion of joy and not of terror to our loyal subjects. If it were not for that, I should have something to say about the state of your men's armor and weapons. As it is, you are pardoned. Command a cask of wine to be opened, that your men may drink our health. But at noon tomorrow I wish to see them here in this courtyard, looking like men-at-arms and not like vagabonds. See to it on pain of our extreme displeasure. The captain gaped, but Bern immediately cried, 3 cheers for the king, and the soldiers who had understood about the cask of wine, even if they understood nothing else, joined in. Caspian then ordered most of his own men to remain in the courtyard. He, with Byrne and Drinian and 4 others, went into the hall. Behind a table at the far end, with various secretaries about him, sat his sufficiency, the governor of the Lone Islands. Gumpus was a bilious-looking man with hair that had once been red and was now mostly gray. He glanced up as the strangers entered and then looked down at his papers, saying automatically, "No interviews without appointments except between 9 and 10 p.m. on second Saturdays." Caspian nodded to Byrne and then stood aside. Byrne and Drinian took a step forward and each seized one end of the table. They lifted it and flung it on one side of the hall, where it rolled over, scattering a cascade of letters, dossiers, ink pots, pens, sealing wax, and documents. Then, not roughly, but as firmly as if their hands were pincers of steel, they plucked Gumpus out of his chair and deposited him facing it about 4 feet away. Caspian at once sat down in the chair and laid his naked sword across his knees. "My lord," said he, fixing his eyes on Gumpus, "you have not given us quite the welcome we expected. I am the king of Narnia." "Nothing about it in the correspondence," said the governor. "Nothing in the minutes. We have not been notified of any such thing, all irregular. Happy to consider any applications. And we are come to inquire into your sufficiency's conduct of your office," continued Caspian. "There are 2 points especially on which I require an explanation. Firstly, I find no record that the tribute due from these islands to the crown of Narnia has been received for about 150 years. "That would be a question to raise at the council next month," said Gumpus. "If anyone moves that a commission of inquiry be set up to report on the financial history of the islands at the first meeting next year, why then—" "I also find it clearly written in our laws," Caspian went on, "that if the tribute is not delivered, the whole debt has to be paid by the governor of the Lone Islands out of his private purse." At this, Gumpus began to pay real attention. "Oh, that's quite out of the question," he said. "It is an economic impossibility, your majesty must be joking." Inside, he was wondering if there were any way of getting rid of these unwelcome visitors. Had he known that Caspian had only 1 ship and 1 ship's company with him, he would have spoken soft words for the moment and hoped to have them all surrounded and killed during the night. But he had seen a ship of war sailing down the straits yesterday and seen it signaling, as he supposed, to its consorts. He had not then known it was the king's ship, for there was not wind enough to spread the flag out and make the Golden Lion visible, so he had waited further developments. Now he imagined that Caspian had a whole fleet at Burnstead. It would never have occurred to Gumpus that anyone would walk into Narrow Haven to take the islands with less than 50 men. It was certainly not at all the kind of thing he could imagine doing himself. "Secondly," said Caspian, "I want to know why you have permitted this abominable and unnatural traffic in slaves to grow up here, contrary to the ancient custom and usage of our dominions." "Necessary, unavoidable," said his sufficiency. "An essential part of the economic development of the islands, I assure you. Our present burst of prosperity depends on it. What need have you of slaves?" "For export, your majesty. Sell them to colormen mostly, and we have other markets. We are a great center of the trade." "In other words," said Caspian, "you don't need them. Tell me what purpose they serve except to put money into the pockets of such as Pug." "Your majesty's tender years," said Gumpus with what was meant to be a fatherly smile, "hardly make it possible that you should understand the economic problems involved. I have statistics, I have graphs, I have—" "Tender as my years may be," said Caspian, "I believe I understand the slave trade from within quite as well as your sufficiency, and I do not see that it brings into the islands meat or bread or beer or wine or timber or cabbages or books or instruments of music or horses or armor or anything else worth having. But whatever it does or not, it must be stopped." "But that would be putting the clock back," gasped the governor. "Have you no idea of progress, of development?" "I have seen them both in an egg," said Caspian. "We call it going bad in Narnia. This trade must stop." "I can take no responsibility for any such measure," said Gumpus. "Very well then," answered Caspian, "we relieve you of your office. My Lord Byrne, come here." And before Gumpus quite realized what was happening, Byrne was kneeling with his hands between the king's hands and taking the oath to govern the Lone Islands in accordance with the old customs, rights, usages, and laws of Narnia. And Caspian said, "I think we have had enough of governors," and made Byrne a duke, the Duke of the Lone Islands. "As for you, my lord," he said to Gumpus, "I forgive you your debt for the tribute, but before noon tomorrow, you and yours must be out of the castle, which is now the duke's residence." "Look here, this is all very well," said one of Gumpus's secretaries, "but suppose all you gentlemen stop play acting and we do a little business. The question before us really is—" "The question is," said the Duke, "whether you and the rest of the rabble will leave without a flogging or with one. You may choose what you prefer." When all this had been pleasantly settled, Caspian ordered horses, of which there were a few in the castle, though very ill-groomed, and he, with Byrne and Drinian and a few others, rode out into the town and made for the slave market. It was a long, low building near the harbor, and the scene which they found going on inside was very much like any other auction. That is to say, there was a great crowd, and Pug on a platform was roaring out in a raucous voice, "Now, gentlemen, lot 23, fine Terebinthian agricultural laborer, suitable for the mines or the galleys, under 25 years of age, not a bad tooth in his head, good brawny fellow, take off his shirt, tax, and let the gentleman see. There's muscle for you. Look at the chest on him. 10 crescents from the gentleman in the corner. You must be joking, sir. 15, 18. 18 is bidden for lot 23. Any advance on 18? 21. Thank you, sir. 21 is bidden. But Pug stopped and gaped when he saw the mail-clad figures who had clanked up to the platform. On your knees, every man of you, to the King of Narnia, said the Duke. Everyone heard the horses jingling and stamping outside, and many had heard some rumor of the landing and the events at the castle. Most obeyed. Those who did not were pulled down by their neighbors. Some cheered. Your life is forfeit, Pug, for laying hands on our royal person yesterday, said Caspian, but your ignorance is pardoned. The slave trade was forbidden in all our dominions quarter of an hour ago. I declare every slave in this market free. He held up his hand to check the cheering of the slaves and went on, Where are my friends? That dear little Gell and the nice young gentleman, said Pug with an ingratiating smile. Why, they were snapped up at once. We're here, Caspian, cried Lucy and Edmund together. And at your service, sire, piped Reepicheep from another corner. They had all been sold, but the men who had bought them were staying to bid for other slaves, and so they had not yet been taken away. The crowd parted to let the three of them out, and there was great hand-clasping and greeting between them and Caspian. Two merchants of Calormen at once approached. The Calormen have dark faces and long beards. They wear flowing robes and orange-colored turbans, and they are a wise, wealthy, courteous, cruel, and ancient people. They bowed most politely to Caspian and paid him long compliments, all about the fountains of prosperity irrigating the gardens of prudence and virtue and things like that. But of course what they wanted was the money they had paid. That is only fair, sir, said Caspian. Every man who has bought a slave today must have his money back. Pug, bring out your takings to the last minum. A minum is the 40th part of a crescent. Does your good majesty mean to beggar me, whined Pug? You have lived on broken hearts all your life, said Caspian, and if you are beggared, it is better to be a beggar than a slave. But where is my other friend? Oh, him, said Pug. Oh, take him, and welcome. Glad to have him off my hands. I've never seen such a drug in the market in all my born days. Priced him at 5 crescents in the end, and even so, nobody'd have him. Threw him in free with other lots, and still no one would have him. Wouldn't touch him, wouldn't look at him. Tax, bring out Sulky. Thus Eustace was produced, and sulky he certainly looked. For though no one would want to be sold as a slave, it is perhaps even more galling to be a sort of utility slave whom no one will buy. He walked up to Caspian and said, I see, as usual. Been enjoying yourself somewhere while the rest of us were prisoners. I suppose you haven't even found out about the British Council. Of course not. That night they had a great feast in the castle of Narrowhaven, and then tomorrow for the beginning of our real adventures, said Reepicheep when he had made his bows to everyone and went to bed. But it could not really be tomorrow or anything like it, for now they were preparing to leave all known lands and seas behind them, and the fullest preparations had to be made. The Dawn Treader was emptied and drawn on land by 8 horses over rollers, and every bit of her was gone over by the most skilled shipwrights. Then she was launched again and victualled and watered as full as she could hold, that is to say for 28 days. Even this, as Edmund noticed with disappointment, only gave them a fortnight's eastward sailing before they had to abandon their quest. While all this was being done, Caspian missed no chance of questioning all the oldest sea captains whom he could find in Narrowhaven, to learn if they had any knowledge or even any rumors of land further to the east. He poured out many a flagon of the castle ale to weather-beaten men with short gray beards and clear blue eyes, and many a tall yarn he heard in return. But those who seemed the most truthful could tell of no lands beyond the lone islands. And many thought that if you sailed too far east, you would come into the surges of a sea without lands that swirled perpetually round the rim of the world. And that, I reckon, is where your majesty's friends went to the bottom. The rest had only wild stories of islands inhabited by headless men, floating islands, waterspouts, and a fire that burned along the water. Only one, to Reepicheep's delight, said, and beyond that, Aslan's country. But that's beyond the end of the world, and you can't get there. But when they questioned him, he could only say that he'd heard it from his father. Bern could only tell them that he had seen his 6 companions sail away eastward, and that nothing had ever been heard of them again. He said this when he and Caspian were standing on the highest point of Aber, looking down on the eastern ocean. I've often been up here of a morning, said the Duke, and seen the sun come up out of the sea, and sometimes it looked as if it were only a couple of miles away. And I've wondered about my friends and wondered what really there is behind that horizon. Nothing, most likely, yet I am always half ashamed that I stayed behind. But I wish your majesty wouldn't go. We may need your help here. This closing the slave market might make a new world. War with Calormen is what I foresee, my liege. Think again. I have an oath, my lord Duke, said Caspian. And anyway, what could I say to Reepicheep? That's the end of chapter 4. This one is called Flossie and the Fox. Flossie! The sound of Big Mama's voice floated past the cabins in Sophie's quarters, round the smokehouse, beyond the chicken coop, all the way down to Flossie Finley. Flossie tucked away her straw doll in a hollow log, then hurried to answer her grandmother's call. "Here I am, Big Mama," Flossie said after catching her breath. It was hot, hotter than a usual Tennessee August day. Big Mama stopped sorting peaches and wiped her hands and face with her apron. "Take these to Miss Viola over at the McCutcheon place," she say, reaching behind her and handing Flossie a basket of fresh eggs. "Seem like they've been trolled by a fox. Miss Viola's chickens be so scared they can't even now lay a stone." Big Mama clicked her teeth and shook her head. "Why come Mr. J.W. can't catch the fox with his dogs?" Flossie asked, putting a peach in her apron pocket to eat later. "Every time they corner that old slickster, he gets away. I tell you, that fox is one sly critter." "How do a fox look?" Flossie asked. "I disremember ever seeing one." Big Mama had to think a bit. "Child, a fox be just a fox. But one thing for sure, that rascal loves eggs. He'll do most anything to get at some eggs." Flossie tucked the basket under her arm and started on her way. "Don't tarry now," Big Mama called, "and be particular about them eggs." "Yes'm," Flossie answered. The way through the woods was shorter and cooler than the road route under the open sun. "What if I come upon a fox?" thought Flossie. "Oh well, a fox be just a fox. That ain't so scary." Flossie commenced to skip along, and when she come upon a critter she couldn't recollect ever seeing. He was sitting side the road like he was expecting somebody. Flossie skipped right up to him and nodded a greeting the way she'd been taught to do. "Top of the morning to you, little missy," the critter replied. "And what is your name?" "I be Flossie Finley," she answered with a proper curtsy. "I reckon I don't know who you be either." Slowly the animal circled around Flossie. "I am a fox," he announced, all the time eyeing the basket of eggs. He stopped in front of Flossie, smiled as best a fox can, and bowed. "At your service." Flossie rocked back on her heels, then up on her toes, back and forward, carefully studying the creature who was claiming to be a fox. "Nope," she said at last, "I just purely don't believe it." "You don't believe what?" Fox asked, looking away from the basket of eggs for the first time. "I don't believe you a fox, that's what." Fox's eyes flashed anger, then he chuckled softly. "My dear child," he said, sounding right disgusted, "of course I'm a fox. A little girl like you should be simply terrified of me. Whatever do they teach children these days?" Flossie tossed her head in the air. "Well, whatever you are, you sure think a heap of yourself," she said, and skipped away. Fox looked shocked. "Wait," he called. "You mean you're not frightened, not just a bit?" Flossie stopped. Then she turned and said, "I ain't never seen a fox before, so why should I be scared of you? And I don't even know now you're a real fox for a fact." Fox pulled himself tall. He cleared his throat. "Are you saying I must offer proof that I'm a fox before you will be frightened of me?" "That's just what I'm saying." Little Flossie skipped on through the piney woods while that fox fella rushed away looking for whatever he needed to prove he was really who he was. Meanwhile, Flossie stopped to rest side of a tree. Suddenly, Fox was beside her. "I have the proof," he said. "See, I have thick, luxurious fur. Feel for yourself." Fox leaned over for Flossie to rub his back. Feels like rabbit fur to me," she said to Fox. "Shucks, you ain't no fox. You're a rabbit, all the time trying to fool me." "Me, a rabbit," he shouted. "I have, my reputation precedes me. I am the third generation of foxes who have outsmarted and outrun Mr. J.W. McCutcheon's fine hunting dogs. I have raided some of the best hen houses from Franklin to Madison. Rabbit indeed. I am a fox, and you will act accordingly." Flossie hopped to her feet. She put her free hand on her hip and patted her foot. "Unless you can show you a fox, I'll not accord you nothing." And without further ceremony, she skipped away. Down the road a piece, Flossie stopped by a bubbly spring. She knelt to get a drink of water. Fox came up to her and said, "I have a long pointed nose. Now that should be proof enough." "Don't prove a thing to me." Flossie picked some wildflowers. "Come to think of it," she said, matter of fact like, "rats got long pointed noses." She snapped her fingers. "That's it. You're a rat trying to pass yourself off as a fox." That near about took Fox's breath away. "I beg your pardon," he gasped. "You can beg all you want to," Flossie said, skipping on down the road. "That still don't make you no fox." "I'll teach you a thing or two, young lady," Fox called after her. "You just wait and see." Before long, Flossie came to a clearing. A large orange tabby was sunning on a tree stump. "Hi, pretty kitty," the girl said, and rubbed the cat behind her ears. Meanwhile, Fox slipped from behind a clump of bushes. "Since you won't believe me when I tell you I'm a fox," he said stiffly, "perhaps you will believe that fine feline creature toward whom you seem to have some measure of respect." Flossie looked at the cat and winked her eye. "He sure use a heap of words," she whispered. Fox beckoned for Cat to speak up. Cat jumped to a nearby log and yawned and stretched. Then she answered, This is a fox because he has sharp claws and yellow eyes, she purred. Fox seemed satisfied, but Flossie looked at Cat. She looked at Fox. Then once more at both, just to be sure. She said, "All due respect, Miss Cat, but both y'all got sharp claws and yellow eyes. So that don't prove nothing, excepting both y'all be cats." Fox went to howling and running around in circles. He was plumb beside himself. "I am a fox and I know it," he shouted. "This is absurd." "No call for you to use that kind of language," Flossie said, and she skipped away. Wait, Fox followed, pleading. "I just remembered something. It may be the solution to this horrible situation." "Good, it's about time." I have a bushy tail." Fox seemed to perk up. "That's right," he said. "All foxes are known for their fluffy, bushy tails. That has got to be adequate proof." "Ain't got to be. You got a bushy tail? So do squirrels." Flossie pointed to one overhead, leaping from branch to branch in the treetops. "Here, have a bite of a peach," she said, offering Fox first bite of her treat. But Fox was crying like a natural-born baby. "No, no, no," he sobbed. "If I promise you I'm a fox, won't that do?" Flossie shook her head no. "Oh, woe is me," Fox hollered. "I may never recover my confidence." Flossie didn't stop walking. "That's just what I've been saying. You just an old confidencer. Come telling me you was a fox and can't prove it. Shame on you." Long about that time, Flossie and the fox came out of the woods. Flossie cupped her hands over her eyes and caught sight of McCutcheon quarters in Miss Viola's cabin. Fox didn't notice a thing. He just followed behind Flossie, begging to be believed. "Give me one last chance," he pleaded. Flossie turned on her heels. "Okay, but just this once more." Fox tried not to whimper, but his voice was real unsteady-like. I have sharp teeth and I can run exceedingly fast." He waited for Flossie to say something. Slowly the girl rocked from heel to toe, back and forward. "You know," she finally said, smiling, "it don't make much difference what I think anymore." "What?" Fox asked. "Why?" "'Cause there's one of Mr. J.W. McCutcheon's hounds behind you. He's got sharp teeth and can run fast too. And by the way that hound's looking, it's all over for you." With a quick glance back, Fox dashed toward the woods. "The hound knows who I am," he shouted, "but I'm not worried. I sure can outsmart and outrun one of Mr. J.W. McCutcheon's miserable mutts any old time of the day because, like I told you, I am a fox." "I know," said Flossie. "I know." And she turned toward Miss Viola's with the basket of eggs safely tucked under her arm. This one is called The Mysterious Tadpole. Uncle McAllister lived in Scotland. Every year he sent Lewis a birthday gift for his nature collection. "This is the best one yet," cried Lewis. The next day he took his entire collection to school for show and tell. "Class, this is a tadpole," said Mrs. Shelbert. She asked Lewis to bring it back often so they could all watch it become a frog. Lewis named the tadpole Alphonse. Every day, Alphonse ate several cheeseburgers. Lewis found that he was eager to learn. When Alphonse became too big for his jar, Lewis moved him to the sink. After Alphonse outgrew the sink, Lewis's parents agreed to let him use the bathtub. One day, Mrs. Shelbert decided that Alphonse was not turning into an ordinary frog. She asked Lewis to stop bringing him to school. I don't know if you can see that, but that gives you a picture of the tadpole. By the time summer vacation arrived, Alphonse was enormous. "He's too big for the bathtub," said Lewis's mother. "He's too big for the apartment," said Lewis's father. "He needs a swimming pool," said Lewis. "There is no place in our apartment for a swimming pool," said his parents. Lewis suggested that they buy the parking lot next door and build a swimming pool. "It could cost more money than we have," said his parents. "Your tadpole will have to be donated to the zoo." The thought of Alphonse in a cage made Lewis very sad. Then in the middle of the night, Lewis remembered that the junior high school had a swimming pool and that nobody used it during the summer. Lewis hid Alphonse under a rug and smuggled him into the school. After making sure that Alphonse felt at home, Lewis went back to bed. Every morning, Lewis spent several hours swimming with his friend. In the afternoon, he earned the money for Alphonse's cheeseburgers by delivering newspapers. Meanwhile, the training continued. Alphonse learned to retrieve things from the bottom of the pool. Summer vacation passed quickly. Lewis worried what would happen to Alphonse now that school had reopened. As soon as the first day ended, he ran to the junior high. The students were getting ready for after-school activities. Lewis arrived just as the first swimming race began. Alphonse was delighted to see all the swimmers. "It's a submarine from another planet," bellowed the coach. "Call the police, call the Navy." "No, it's a tadpole," cried Louis. "He's my pet." The coach was upset and confused. "You have until tomorrow," he cried, "to get that creature out of the pool." Louis didn't know what to do. On the way home, he met his friend, Miss Severs, the librarian, and he told her his problem. Miss Severs went back to the junior high school with Louis, but when she saw Alphonse, she was so shocked she dropped her purse and the book she was carrying into the swimming pool. Alphonse retrieved them. Then Miss Severs telephoned Louis's Uncle McAllister in Scotland. He told her that he had caught the little tadpole in Loch Ness, a large lake near his cottage. Miss Severs said, "I'm convinced that your uncle has given you a very rare Loch Ness monster." "I don't care," cried Louis. "He's my pet and I love him." He begged